The Winchester clicked as Margaret Ellison raised it to her shoulder, aiming at the man who'd just proposed marriage by announcing she needed strong sons. Elias Boone stood unflinching in her doorway, all 6 feet 6 of him blocking out the Wyoming sun, his voice rumbling like distant thunder. "Lower the gun, Miss Ellison. I'm offering you a life, not threatening it." Her finger trembled on the trigger. How did a simple Tuesday afternoon lead to this moment? Let me tell you this remarkable story, and don't forget to comment below which town you're watching from, so I can see how far this tale has traveled. The morning had started like any other in Red Fern Ridge, Wyoming, 1882. Margaret Ellison stood before her classroom of 12 students, their ages ranging from 6 to 16, teaching them the proper conjugation of Latin verbs. The November wind rattled the windows of the one-room schoolhouse, carrying with it the promise of an early winter. At 33, Margaret had long since accepted her fate as the town's spinster, the educated woman from Boston who'd come west 10 years ago following a scandal that still made her mother write tearful letters begging her to return home. "Miss Ellison," young Tommy Hartwell raised his hand, his freckled face scrunched in concentration. "Why do we need to learn Latin when nobody speaks it anymore?" Margaret set down her chalk, smoothing her brown wool dress, practical, not fashionable, like everything in her life had become. "Because, Thomas, Latin teaches us to think precisely. Every word has its exact place, its perfect meaning. In a world full of confusion, precision matters." "Like when Pa measures fence posts?" the boy persisted. "Exactly like that," Margaret smiled, though privately she thought precision in life was largely an illusion. After all, she'd planned her life precisely once: engagement to a banker's son, a house in Boston's Back Bay, children by 25. Instead, here she stood, teaching other people's children in a town where the largest building was Hutchison's General Store. The school day ended at 3 o'clock sharp. Margaret dismissed her students into the bright, cold afternoon, watching them scatter like seeds on the wind, some heading to farms, others to the cluster of buildings that formed Red Fern Ridge's modest downtown. She remained behind to clean the slate boards and prepare tomorrow's lessons, tasks that filled the hollow hours between work and sleep. It was nearly 5 when she finally locked the schoolhouse door and began her walk to the small cottage she rented from Widow Morrison. The cottage sat a quarter-mile from town, isolated enough that she could maintain the careful distance she'd cultivated over the years. People respected Miss Ellison, even liked her, but she belonged to no one. No family, no close friends, just the polite acquaintance of a woman who'd made herself useful but not essential. The sound of hoofbeats made her look up. A massive black horse thundered down the main road, its rider even more imposing than the animal. Margaret had seen Elias Boone before. Everyone in Red Fern Ridge knew the rancher who owned the largest spread in 3 counties, but always from a distance. He was the kind of man who seemed built from the landscape itself, weathered, solid, and utterly uncompromising. To her surprise, he reined in beside her. "Miss Ellison?" His voice was exactly what she'd expected, deep, rough as unplaned wood. "Mr. Boone." She nodded politely, continuing to walk. He dismounted and fell into step beside her, leading his horse. The animal's shoulders stood higher than her head. "I need to speak with you," he said without preamble. "If it's about young Samuel, he's doing much better with his arithmetic. It's not about my nephew." They walked in silence for several paces. Margaret felt acutely aware of his presence, the way he seemed to displace the very air around him, the scent of leather and wood smoke that clung to his coat, the fact that she had to crane her neck to see his face when she glanced sideways. "Then what is it about, Mr. Boone?" He stopped walking. She took 2 more steps before realizing he wasn't beside her and turned back. The late afternoon sun caught his face, revealing features that were harsh but not unkind, a nose that had been broken at least once, deep-set gray eyes that reminded her of winter storms, a jaw that could have been carved from granite. He wasn't handsome in any conventional sense, but there was something arresting about him, like a mountain that demanded attention simply by existing. "I need a wife," he said. Margaret blinked. Of all the things she'd expected him to say, this hadn't even made the list. I beg your pardon?" "I need a wife," he repeated, as if she'd simply misheard rather than been completely blindsided. And you need strong sons to guard your winters. Heat flooded her face, anger, embarrassment, and something else she couldn't name. Mr. Boone, I don't know what game you're playing, but no game. He pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. This is a marriage contract. I had lawyer Henderson draw it up. It's all legal and proper. Margaret stared at the paper as if it might bite her. You had a lawyer draw up a marriage contract? For me? We've never even had a conversation. We're having one now. This is not a conversation. This is madness. She turned on her heel and strode toward her cottage. He followed, his long legs easily keeping pace with her hurried steps. Miss Ellison, hear me out. I most certainly will not. You're 33 years old, living alone in a cottage that's got gaps in the walls wide enough to let in snow come January. You make $40 a month teaching, half of which goes to rent. You've got no family here, no prospects, and from what I can tell, no desire to return to wherever you came from back east. She whirled on him, fury making her brave. How dare you! You know nothing about me. I know you send money to a woman in Boston every month. Your mother, I'd guess. I know you've refused 3 marriage proposals since you've been here, all from men who couldn't offer you anything more than what you already have. I know you read books in Latin and Greek that you order from Denver, and that you play piano in the church even though you don't attend services. Margaret felt exposed, like he'd peeled back her carefully constructed walls with those gray eyes. You've been watching me? I've been considering you. For how long? 6 months. The admission sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the November wind. Why? For the first time since he'd stopped her, Elias Boone looked uncomfortable. He shifted his weight, his hand tightening on his horse's reins. My ranch needs a woman's touch. My nephew Samuel needs a mother's influence. His parents died last year, and I'm all he's got. And He paused, seeming to wrestle with the words. I'm 37 years old, Miss Ellison. I've built an empire out of wilderness, but there's no point to any of it if there's no one to leave it to. So find a young woman who can give you a dozen children. I don't want a young woman. I want someone with sense, education, strength. Someone who won't fold when winter comes hard or when the cattle market crashes. Someone who can teach my children, our children, more than just how to rope and ride. Our children. The words sent an unexpected flutter through her stomach. Margaret pressed a hand to her middle, trying to quiet the sensation. Mr. Boone, what you're suggesting, it's a business arrangement. Yes. Marriage should be about love. About love? He gave a short, harsh laugh. Love is what killed my brother. He loved Samuel's mother so much that when she died birthing the boy, he put a gun in his mouth and left me to raise his son. Love is what sent you running from Boston. Don't deny it. I can see it in your face. Love is a luxury neither of us can afford. The truth of his words hit her like a physical blow. She had run from love, from the scandal of loving a man who'd chosen another, from the humiliation of being discarded like an unfashionable dress. Even if what you say is true, why should I trust you? You're a stranger to me, because I'm offering you honesty, not pretty words. You keep teaching if you want. I've no objection to an educated wife. You'll have a solid house, not a drafty cottage. You'll have respect as Mrs. Boone, not pity as the aging schoolmarm. And you'll have children of your own, not just other people's to borrow for a few hours each day. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back furiously. He'd touched on her deepest ache, the children she taught but couldn't keep, the babies she'd never rock, the families she'd never have. And what do you get, Mr. Boone? A partner. Someone to help me build something that lasts. Someone who won't expect me to be anything other than what I am. Which is what, exactly? He met her gaze directly. A hard man who knows how to work, how to fight when necessary, and how to keep his word. I won't promise you romance, Miss Ellison, but I'll promise you safety, stability, and respect. That's more than most marriages have after the wedding flowers wilt. They'd reached her cottage. Margaret stood at the gate, one hand on the latch, torn between the safe loneliness inside and the dangerous possibility he offered. This is insane. People don't just decide to marry like they're buying cattle. Maybe they should. might have fewer broken hearts and more solid families. She turned to face him fully. In the dying light, he looked like something out of the wilderness itself, untamed, powerful, and strangely magnetic. I need time to think. I'll come for your answer tomorrow evening. He handed her the contract. Read it. It's fair. Henderson made sure of that. You keep your own money, your own property. If you want to leave after a year, you can, with a settlement that'll set you up anywhere you choose to go. And if there are children by then? They stay with me. His jaw tightened. But you'd have visiting rights. It's all in the contract. Margaret took the paper with trembling fingers. Why me, Mr. Boone? Really, why? He was quiet for a long moment, looking past her at the cottage with its crooked chimney and patched roof. Because you've survived being broken without becoming bitter. Because you teach Latin to farm kids like it matters. Because when Tommy Hartwell's family couldn't pay your fee last winter, you tutored him anyway and never said a word about it. Because you're the kind of woman who could make a man like me almost believe in something softer than survival. Before she could respond, he mounted his horse in one fluid motion and touched the brim of his hat. Tomorrow evening, Miss Ellison. She watched him ride away, disappearing into the gathering darkness like a force of nature returning to the wild. The contract felt heavy in her hands, heavier than paper should ever feel. Inside her cottage, she lit a lamp with shaking fingers and spread the document on her small table. It was exactly as he'd said, fair, practical, devoid of sentiment. But between the legal phrases and careful provisions, she read something else. The careful planning of a man who'd thought through every contingency, who was offering her not a cage but a carefully negotiated freedom. She could keep teaching. She could keep her savings. She could even leave if she chose, though something told her that once she entered Elias Boone's world, leaving would be the last thing she'd want. Margaret sat at her table until the lamp oil ran low, reading and rereading the contract. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through those gaps in the walls he'd mentioned. She thought about another winter here, alone, watching other people's children grow while her own womb remained empty. She thought about the whispers that followed her. Poor Miss Ellison. Such a shame. She was pretty once. She thought about the letters she'd write to her mother, trying to explain a marriage that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with survival. But mostly, she thought about Elias Boone's eyes when he'd said she could make him believe in something softer than survival. There had been a flash of vulnerability there, quickly hidden but unmistakable. Perhaps he needed saving as much as she did, just in a different way. The next day passed in a blur. Margaret taught her lessons mechanically, her mind elsewhere. The children sensed her distraction. Even young Tommy was unusually quiet. When 3 o'clock came, she dismissed them and sat alone in the empty schoolhouse, staring at the McGuffey's reader on her desk without seeing the words. Miss Ellison. She looked up to find Samuel Boone in the doorway, Elias's nephew. At 15, he already showed signs of growing into his uncle's impressive height, though he was still gangly as a colt. His eyes, she noticed, were the same storm gray as Elias's. Samuel, did you forget something? No, ma'am. He shifted awkwardly. I wanted to... That is, Uncle Elias said he spoke to you. Heat flooded her cheeks. Did he? He doesn't know I'm here. I snuck out while he was checking the fence lines. Samuel stepped closer, his young face earnest. I wanted you to know. If you say yes, I'd be glad. Real glad. The house is too quiet, and Uncle Elias, he's a good man, but he doesn't know how to talk about anything except cattle and weather. It'd be nice to have someone who reads books and knows about things beyond Wyoming. Margaret's heart clenched. Samuel, I know it's not my business. But Uncle Elias, he's been different since my parents died. Harder, quieter, like he's turning into stone from the inside out. Maybe you could stop that from happening. The boy left before she could respond, leaving her alone with an even heavier decision. It wasn't just about her and Elias anymore. There was Samuel to consider, a motherless boy hungry for warmth in a house that had forgotten how to provide it. That evening, she dressed carefully in her best dress, still plain by Boston standards, but the finest thing she owned. She braided her hair more loosely than usual, allowing a few tendrils to frame her face. If she was going to accept or refuse a marriage proposal, she might as well look like a woman worth proposing to. She heard the hoofbeats before she saw him. Elias Boone rode up to her cottage just as the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. He dismounted and knocked on her door, proper this time, she noted with dark amusement. When she opened the door, his eyes widened slightly, taking in her appearance. "Miss Ellison, you look different. I thought the occasion called for something more than my teaching clothes. May I come in?" It was improper, a single woman allowing a single man into her home in the evening, but then again, nothing about this situation followed conventional rules. "Please." Her cottage was sparse but clean, a main room with a stove, table, and 2 chairs, with her bed hidden behind a curtain in the alcove. She'd made tea, though she suspected he'd prefer whiskey. "Tea?" she offered. "Thank you." He sat carefully in one of her chairs, looking absurdly large in the small space. The chair creaked under his weight, but held. She poured for both of them, her hands surprisingly steady. They sat across from each other, the contract lying on the table between them like a bridge or a barrier, she wasn't sure which. "Before I give you my answer," Margaret said, "I have questions. Ask them. What about affection? Not love. I understand that's off the table, but surely there should be some warmth between husband and wife." He considered this, turning his teacup in his large hands with surprising delicacy. "I'm not a warm man, Miss Ellison. But I'm not cruel either. There would be respect, courtesy, perhaps in time, friendship. And the physical aspects of marriage?" His ears reddened slightly, the first sign of embarrassment she'd seen from him. "That would be your choice. I want children, yes, but I won't force myself on any woman. When you're ready, if you're ready, we'll handle that aspect with the same honesty as everything else." Margaret appreciated his directness, even as the topic made her pulse quicken. "Your ranch. I've heard it's isolated. 20 miles from town, but I go in every week for supplies. You could come whenever you wished. Keep teaching if that's what you want. The other ranchers' wives, they'll talk. Let them. My ranch produces more beef than the next 3 combined. Money silences a lot of gossip. And if I can't have children? I'm 33, Mr. Boone. There's no guarantee." For the first time, he reached across the table, his calloused hand covering hers briefly before withdrawing. "Then we'll raise Samuel and any other strays that need a home. The territory's full of orphans. We'll make our family one way or another." His touch, brief as it was, sent warmth up her arm. Margaret stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening sky. Behind her, she heard him shift in his chair, but he didn't speak, giving her time to think. She thought about her mother's letters, increasingly desperate, begging her to come home and accept her disgrace with dignity. She thought about the children she taught, growing up and leaving while she remained static as a pressed flower. She thought about Elias Boone's ranch, which she'd seen only from a distance. The big house on the hill, the vast herds of cattle, the empire he'd built from nothing. But mostly, she thought about the loneliness that had become her constant companion, so familiar she'd almost stopped noticing its weight. Here was a chance to set it down, even if what she picked up instead was uncertainty. "I have conditions," she said, still facing the window. "Name them." "I continue teaching until we have children of our own to tend." "Agreed." "I want a small account of my own, separate from household expenses." "How much?" $20 a month." "Done." "And I want—" She turned to face him. "I want you to talk to me. Really talk. Not about weather and cattle, but about thoughts, ideas, dreams, if you have them. I can't live with a silent man." He stood slowly, unfolding to his full height. "I can try. I'm not used to talking about such things." "Neither am I anymore. We can learn together." "Is that a yes, Miss Ellison?" Margaret walked to the table and picked up the contract. From her writing desk, she took her pen and ink. With careful strokes, she signed her name on the line marked Bride. "When?" "Saturday, 3 days from now. Judge Morrison does weddings at the courthouse." 3 days? Her voice rose slightly. "No point in waiting." Winter's coming fast it. Better you're settled at the ranch before the big snows. She wanted to argue, but there was logic in his words. There was logic in everything he said, which was both comforting and infuriating. Saturday, then. He took the contract, folding it carefully and returning it to his pocket. For a moment they stood facing each other, uncertain. Then he stepped closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "This will work, Margaret. May I call you Margaret?" "Yes." "And may I call you Elias?" "Yes." He lifted his hand as if to touch her face, then let it fall. "This will work because we both know what we're getting. No false expectations, no pretty lies, just truth and effort." "That's all?" "That's everything." After he left, Margaret sat in her quiet cottage and wondered what she'd done. In 3 days, she'd be Mrs. Elias Boone, wife to a man she barely knew, stepmother to a grieving boy, mistress of a ranch she'd never seen up close. The safe, small life she'd built was ending, and something vast and uncertain was beginning. She thought about writing to her mother, but what would she say? "I'm marrying a stranger because I'm tired of being alone? I've traded my independence for the chance at children? I've given up on love and settled for respect?" No, she'd write after the wedding, when it was too late for her mother's tears to change anything. The next 3 days passed in a whirlwind of preparations. Word of the impending marriage spread through Red Fern Ridge like wildfire. Some of the ladies from town came calling, their curiosity barely masked by congratulations. "Such a surprise!" Mrs. Henderson, the lawyer's wife, chirped over tea. "We had no idea you and Mr. Boone were courting." "It was very private," Margaret replied, which wasn't exactly a lie. "Well, he's quite a catch," Mrs. Davis from the Mercantile added. "All that land, all those cattle. You'll be the richest woman in 3 counties." "I'm sure that will be nice," Margaret said neutrally. Mrs. Patterson, the minister's wife, was less tactful. "Of course he is rather rough. Not exactly the kind of man one pictures you with, dear." "What kind of man did you picture me with?" Margaret asked sweetly. The woman flustered. "Well, someone more refined, educated, like that nice Mr. Whitman who proposed last year." Mr. Whitman was 63 and had buried 2 wives already. Still, he could quote Shakespeare. "Elias Boone can move mountains," Margaret replied. "I think that's poetry enough." Friday night, her last night in the cottage, Margaret packed her few possessions. Her books filled 2 crates, the Latin texts, the Greek classics, the novels she'd hidden from disapproving eyes. Her clothes barely filled 1 trunk. The quilt her grandmother had made, the photograph of her parents, the silver brush set that was the only reminder of her once comfortable life. All of it fit into a few containers, the sum of 33 years looking pitifully small. She slept poorly, starting at every sound. When dawn came, she rose and dressed in her best dress again. She had nothing specifically for a wedding, and there was no time to make or buy anything. She pinned her hair up carefully and looked at herself in the small mirror. The woman looking back seemed like a stranger, pale, wide-eyed, on the verge of something irreversible. At 9 o'clock, Elias arrived with a wagon for her things and a bouquet of wildflowers. "Samuel picked them," he said gruffly, handing them to her. "Said weddings need flowers." They were already wilting, clearly picked hours ago by an eager boy, but Margaret held them like they were precious orchids. "They're perfect." The ride to the courthouse was quiet. Margaret sat beside Elias on the wagon seat, acutely aware of his presence, the space between them that seemed both too much and not enough. The town was busy for a Saturday morning, and she felt every eye on them as they rode down Main Street. At the courthouse, Judge Morrison waited with Samuel, and to Margaret's surprise, several others, the Hendersons, Doc Carter, and his wife, even some of Elias's ranch hands. It seemed their private arrangement would have a public witnessing. The ceremony was brief, functional. Judge Morrison read the legal words while Margaret tried to focus on their meaning rather than the magnitude of what she was doing. When it came time for the ring, Elias produced a simple gold band. "His mother's," Samuel whispered to her. "With this ring, I thee wed," Elias said, his deep voice steady as he slipped it onto her finger. It was slightly too large, but Margaret closed her hand to keep it in place. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, There was an awkward pause where a kiss would traditionally occur. Elias leaned down and brushed his lips against her forehead, brief, formal, but not unkind. "Welcome to the family, Aunt Margaret," Samuel burst out, unable to contain himself any longer. He hugged her impulsively, and over his shoulder she saw Elias watching with an expression she couldn't read. The wedding breakfast at the hotel was Elias's doing. She hadn't expected any celebration, but he'd arranged for a meal for all the witnesses. Margaret found herself swept into conversations with the ranch wives, receiving advice about everything from altitude sickness to preserving meat for winter. Through it all, she was conscious of Elias across the room, talking with his men, his eyes occasionally finding hers. Finally, it was time to leave for the ranch. Her things were loaded in the wagon, her old life packed away in crates and trunks. As they rode out of town, Margaret turned for one last look at the schoolhouse. Monday, someone else would stand at that desk, teaching those children. The thought brought unexpected tears to her eyes. "You can go back," Elias said quietly. "To teach, I mean. Whenever you want." "I know." She wiped her eyes quickly. "It's just strange leaving something I've done for so long." Change usually is. The road to the ranch wound through increasingly wild country. The mountains grew closer, their peaks already white with snow. The land opened up, vast and intimidating. Margaret had lived in Wyoming for 10 years, but always in town, always contained. This was different. This was the true frontier where civilization was a suggestion rather than a fact. "There, Sah," Elias said finally, pointing ahead. The Boone Ranch spread across a valley like a kingdom. The main house sat on a rise, commanding views in all directions. It was larger than she'd expected, 2 stories of solid timber and stone, with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. Barns and outbuildings clustered below, and beyond them, hundreds of cattle dotted the grasslands. "It's impressive," Margaret said. "It's home," Elias replied. "Your home now." As they pulled up to the house, the door flew open and Samuel ran out, followed more sedately by a middle-aged Mexican woman. "This is Rosa," Elias said. "She's been keeping house since Samuel was small. She's offered to stay on and help you get settled." Rosa's dark eyes assessed Margaret shrewdly, then she smiled. "Welcome, Senora Boone. The house has needed a woman's presence for too long. Inside, the house was masculine, but not unwelcoming. Heavy furniture, likely made by Elias himself, filled rooms that were clean but sparse. The kitchen was enormous, dominated by a massive stove that Rosa had already begun explaining before Margaret could catch her breath. "I'll show you to your room," Elias said, interrupting Rosa's enthusiastic tour. Margaret followed him upstairs, her heart beginning to pound. They discussed the physical aspects of marriage, but discussing and facing them were different things. He led her to a door at the end of the hall and opened it. The room was clearly meant for her, feminine touches that hadn't been there before, she was sure. A quilted bedspread in soft blues and greens, curtains at the windows, even a small bookshelf already waiting for her volumes. Through a connecting door she glimpsed another bedroom. His, she realized. "I thought you should have your own space," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. Unless you decide otherwise." Relief and something else. Disappointment washed through her. "It's lovely. Thank you. I'll leave you to settle in. Dinner's at 6. He paused at the door. "Margaret, we're going to make this work." It sounded like a promise or maybe a prayer. That first evening set the pattern for the days that followed. Dinner with Elias and Samuel, conversation that started stilted but gradually loosened. Samuel was eager for her attention, hungry for stories about Boston, about the books she'd read, about anything beyond the boundaries of ranch life. Elias listened more than he talked, but when he did speak, his observations were thoughtful, sometimes surprisingly insightful. After dinner, Elias would retreat to his study to work on the ranch accounts while Margaret and Samuel sat by the fire. She read to him from Ivanhoe, doing voices for the characters that made him laugh. Sometimes she caught Elias standing in the doorway, watching them, that unreadable expression on his face. The days fell into rhythm. Elias and his men worked the ranch, preparing for winter, moving cattle to lower pastures, reinforcing fences, storing feed. Margaret took over the household management from a grateful Rosa, learning the systems of a much larger home than she'd ever managed. She also began tutoring Samuel more formally, discovering a sharp mind that had been neglected in favor of physical labor. "You could go to college," she told him one afternoon as they worked through a geometry problem. Samuel laughed. "Uncle Elias needs me here." "Your uncle wants what's best for you." "This ranch is what's best." "It's my inheritance, isn't it?" Margaret thought about that conversation as she watched Elias that evening. He'd come in late, covered in mud from pulling a calf out of a bog. As he washed at the kitchen pump, she saw the exhaustion in the lines of his body, the weight he carried trying to run an empire essentially alone. "You should hire more men," she said impulsively. He looked up, water dripping from his face. "What?" "You're working yourself into the ground." "And Samuel, he's bright, Elias. He could do more than ranch work. Ranch work built everything you see here." "I'm not disparaging it. I'm saying there's room for both. Hire men for the physical labor. Let Samuel learn the business side, maybe even go to college. An educated man could take this ranch even further." Elias dried his face slowly. "You've been here a week and you're already trying to change things? Isn't that why you married me? To bring change?" He studied her for a long moment. "Maybe it is." That night, she heard him pacing in his room, the floor creaking under his weight. She lay in her own bed, listening, wondering what thoughts kept him awake. The connecting door between their rooms seemed to pulse with possibility, but neither of them had made any move toward opening it. The November wind howled through the valley like a living thing, rattling the windows of the ranch house with increasing fury. Margaret had been Mrs. Boone for 2 weeks now, and still she startled when Rosa addressed her as Señora. The title felt like a coat that didn't quite fit, too heavy across the shoulders, too long in the sleeves. This particular morning, she woke to find frost painting intricate patterns on her bedroom window. Through the glass, she could see Elias already at work, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air as he directed his men in moving the last of the cattle to winter pasture. Even from this distance, she could recognize his commanding presence, the way other men automatically deferred to his judgment. "Aunt Margaret!" Samuel's voice carried up the stairs. "There's a rider coming!" She descended quickly, still pinning up her hair. Through the front window, she could see a lone horseman approaching fast, his mount lathered with sweat despite the cold. Elias had noticed too, breaking away from the cattle drive to intercept the rider. Margaret watched as the two men conversed, noting the way Elias's posture shifted from curiosity to tension. His hand moved to the gun at his hip, though he didn't draw it. After several minutes, he dismissed the rider and strode toward the house, his face grim. "What is it?" Margaret asked as he entered, bringing the cold with him. "Marcus Holloway." The name came out like a curse. "He's filed a claim on the eastern section of my land. Says he has papers proving his father bought it from mine 30 years ago." Samuel, who'd been listening from the doorway, went pale. "But that's where we graze the yearlings. It's got the best water access." "I know exactly what it is," Elias said darkly. He moved to his study, Margaret and Samuel following. From a locked drawer, he pulled out a leather portfolio thick with documents. "My father kept meticulous records. There's no sale to anyone named Holloway." "Then it's a lie," Margaret said. Elias looked at her with something like approval. "Of course it's a lie. But Holloway's got Judge Crawford in his pocket over in Millstone. If this goes to his court, papers have a way of becoming real enough." "What about Judge Morrison here?" "Holloway's too smart to file in a jurisdiction where he doesn't own the law." Elias spread the documents on his desk, his jaw tight. "He's been planning this. Waiting until." He trailed off, but Margaret understood. Waiting until Elias seemed distracted, perhaps vulnerable with a new wife to protect. "What do we do?" Samuel asked, and Margaret noticed the "we," the boy, already including her in the family's troubles. "First, we make sure every head of cattle is off that section before Holloway tries to claim them as damages. Then," Elias paused, his gray eyes meeting Margaret's. "Then we fight. But this could get ugly. Holloway doesn't play by gentlemen's rules." "Neither do I," Margaret said quietly, surprising herself with the fierceness in her voice. Elias studied her for a long moment. "No, I don't believe you do." The next days were controlled chaos. Every available hand was pressed into service moving cattle, a massive undertaking made more difficult by the worsening weather. Margaret found herself in the thick of it, learning to ride astride rather than side saddle, a necessity that would have scandalized her Boston relatives, but seemed merely practical here. "You're taking to this quicker than I expected," Elias commented one evening, finding her in the barn rubbing liniment into her sore muscles. "Necessity is an excellent teacher," she replied, wincing as she worked her shoulder. "Here." He moved behind her, his large hands taking over the task. "You're tensing wrong in the saddle. Try to move with the horse, not against it." His touch was clinical, but Margaret felt heat spread from his fingers through her entire body. They'd maintained careful physical distance since the wedding, but now, with his hands on her shoulders, that distance collapsed. "Elias," she began, not sure what she wanted to say. "I know," he said quietly, his hands stilling. "I know this isn't what you signed up for." Ranch wars weren't in the contract. She turned to face him, having to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "Nothing about this marriage has been what I expected. That's not necessarily bad." Something shifted in his expression, a softening she'd glimpsed before but never so clearly. He lifted one hand to her face, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. "Margaret, Uncle Elias!" Samuel burst into the barn. "Riders coming!" "Lots of them." The moment shattered. Elias grabbed his rifle from where it leaned against the wall, and Margaret followed him out into the yard. A dozen men on horseback were approaching, and even in the dying light, she could see they weren't ranch hands. "Stay in the house," Elias ordered, but Margaret stood her ground. "I'm your wife." "I stand with you." He looked like he wanted to argue, but the riders were too close. The man in the lead was everything Elias wasn't. Smooth, polished, wearing a suit that belonged in a Denver boardroom rather than on the Wyoming range. Marcus Holloway, she assumed. "Boone," Holloway called out, his voice carrying an Eastern accent that reminded Margaret uncomfortably of home. "I've come to discuss our situation like civilized men." "Nothing civilized about theft, Holloway." Holloway dismounted with practiced ease, his men remaining on their horses, hands resting casually near their weapons. "Theft is such an ugly word. I prefer to call it reclaiming family property." His eyes found Margaret. "Mrs. Boone, I presume?" I heard Elias had finally taken a wife. How charming. The way he said charming made it sound like an insult. Margaret lifted her chin. "Mr. Holloway, I can't say it's a pleasure." He laughed, a sound like silk being torn. "Spirit! How delightful. You'll need it, living way out here. So isolated. So many things can happen on the frontier." "Is that a threat?" Elias stepped partially in front of Margaret. "Merely an observation. Accidents happen. Fires start, cattle sicken, Indians raid." Holloway's smile was cold as winter moonlight. "A wise man would accept my generous offer to buy the disputed land. For pennies on the dollar, no doubt. Something is better than nothing, Boone, and nothing is what you'll have if you fight me on this." "Get off my land." Holloway remounted his horse with the same practiced grace. "You have until the end of the month to reconsider. After that, I'll take what's mine through the courts, and if that doesn't work." He let the threat hang in the air like smoke. "Good evening, Mrs. Boone. I do hope you enjoy what time you have here." They watched the riders disappear into the darkness. Margaret felt Elias trembling beside her, but when she looked, she realized it was rage, not fear, making him shake. "I should have killed him," he said quietly. "And hang for murder? That's what he wants. You to lose control, make a mistake." Margaret touched his arm. "We need to be smarter than that." "We? I told you. I stand with you." That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She heard Elias pacing again, but this time she rose, wrapped a shawl around her nightgown, and knocked on the connecting door. "Come in." His voice was rough. She found him standing by his window, silhouetted against the starlight. His room was Spartan, a bed, a dresser, a single chair. No softness anywhere except for a photograph on the nightstand, a woman who must have been his mother. "You should sleep," she said. "Tomorrow will be difficult enough without exhaustion." "Can't." Every time I close my eyes, I see everything my father built being torn apart by that vulture. Margaret moved to stand beside him at the window. Tell me about your father. Elias was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, he came here with nothing. Just determination and a dream of building something lasting. He fought Indians, outlaws, weather, disease, survived it all. Then one day his horse spooked at a snake, broke his neck in the fall. All that strength, all that struggle, and a moment's random chance ended it. How old were you? 18. Old enough to take over, barely. I've held this place together for 19 years, expanded it, made it profitable even in bad years, and now Holloway wants to steal it with false papers and corrupt judges. We won't let him. Elias turned to look at her, and in the starlight she saw vulnerability in his face. Why do you care? You've been here 2 weeks. This isn't your fight. Isn't it? Margaret challenged. I'm your wife. Your fights are mine now. A paper marriage, a contract. Is that all it is? The question hung between them, dangerous as a loaded gun. Elias reached out slowly, giving her time to step back. When she didn't, his hand cupped her face, thumb tracing her cheekbone as it had in the barn. You confuse me, Margaret Ellison Boone. I thought I was getting a practical arrangement. Instead, I got a warrior disguised as a schoolteacher. Maybe you got both. He leaned down slowly, and this time there was no Samuel to interrupt. His lips met hers, gentle at first, then with increasing certainty as she responded. Margaret had been kissed before, passionate kisses from the man in Boston who'd ultimately chosen another. But this was different. This was earth and fire, strength and need, a claiming that went both ways. When they separated, both breathing hard, Elias rested his forehead against hers. This complicates things. Everything about us is complicated, Margaret pointed out. Stay, he said suddenly. Tonight. Not for... Just stay. I sleep better when you're near. It was perhaps the most vulnerable admission he'd made. Margaret nodded, and he led her to his bed. They lay carefully apart at first, but during the night, they gravitated toward each other. Margaret woke at dawn to find herself curved against Elias's side, his arm around her, both of them fully clothed but more intimate than if they'd been naked. The peace didn't last. Over breakfast, one of the ranch hands rode in with news that fences on the eastern section had been cut during the night, and several cattle were missing. It's starting, Elias said grimly. What followed was a campaign of harassment that tested everyone's nerves. Cut fences, stolen cattle, poisoned water holes. Holloway was careful never to leave evidence that could prove his involvement, but everyone knew who was responsible. Margaret threw herself into the battle with a determination that surprised even her. She organized the ranch wives to take turns keeping watch, reasoning that Holloway's men might hesitate to harm women. She wrote letters to every newspaper in the territory, describing the situation in terms that painted Holloway as a carpetbagging villain and Elias as a heroic defender of honest ranching. You're waging a propaganda war, Elias observed one evening, finding her surrounded by papers and ink. Public opinion matters, even here. If Holloway becomes too notorious, even corrupt judges might hesitate to support him. But the stress was taking its toll. Samuel had nightmares, waking screaming about fires and gunshots. Rosa jumped at every sound. Even the ranch hands were on edge, weapons always within reach. The first snow came early, blanketing the valley in white that should have been peaceful but felt like a shroud. Margaret stood on the porch, watching the flakes fall, when she heard horses approaching. Her hand went to the rifle she'd learned to keep nearby, but relaxed when she recognized the lead rider, Tom Patterson, Elias's foreman. Mrs. Boone, Tom touched his hat. Is the boss around? We've got a situation. Elias emerged from the barn, and Tom's expression told the story before his words. They hit the Northern Line shack, burned it to the ground. Jake and Murphy were inside. Are they... Elias couldn't finish the question. Jake's dead. Murphy's bad burned, but might make it if we can get him to Doc Carter. Margaret felt the world tilt. She'd served Jake coffee just yesterday morning, listened to him talk about the girl he was courting in town. Now he was gone, killed in a war that was escalating beyond threats and property damage. Get Murphy to town, Elias ordered. Take 4 men as escort. Margaret, go with them. No, this isn't a debate. It's not safe here anymore. I said no. Margaret stepped closer to him, lowering her voice so the men wouldn't hear. If I run now, what kind of message does that send? That Mrs. Boone can be scared off? That you're weak enough to send your woman away? I'm trying to protect you. I didn't ask for protection. I asked for partnership. Partners don't abandon each other when things get difficult. They stared at each other, wills clashing. Finally, Elias turned away. Tom, get Murphy to town, double the watch here, and send word to Sheriff Clayton. Tell him we've got a murder on our hands now. But Sheriff Clayton, when he arrived the next day, brought disappointing news. Without witnesses or evidence, I can't arrest Holloway. Jake could have been smoking in the line shack, accidentally started the fire himself. Jake didn't smoke, Elias said flatly. I know that, you know that, but a court needs proof, and we don't have any. That night, Margaret found Elias standing over Jake's freshly dug grave. They'd buried him on a hillside overlooking the valley, a spot with a view of the mountains. He was 23, Elias said quietly. Worked for me since he was 16. I promised his mother I'd look after him when she was dying. Margaret slipped her hand into his. This isn't your fault, isn't it? I could end this tomorrow, sign over the land, let Holloway win. And then what? He takes more, and more after that? Men like Holloway don't stop. Give them an inch, and they'll take everything. Even if fighting costs more lives? Even then. Because if we don't fight now, who will? The next rancher he targets? The one after that? Someone has to say no. Elias pulled her against him, burying his face in her hair. I didn't want this kind of life for you. When I proposed this arrangement, I pictured quiet years building something together. We are building something, just not quietly. The next weeks brought a strange dichotomy. By day, they fought Holloway's escalating campaign, rebuilt burned structures, doctored poisoned cattle, hired more guards. By night, Margaret and Elias grew closer, the shared danger stripping away pretense and careful distance. She moved into his room permanently, though they still hadn't consummated the marriage. Instead, they lay together in the dark, talking in ways neither had talked to anyone before. Elias told her about his loneliness after his father's death, the weight of responsibility that had shaped him into hardness. Margaret spoke of the scandal in Boston, the man who'd courted her for 2 years, then married another for her larger dowry, leaving Margaret's reputation in ruins. His loss, Elias said firmly. If he couldn't see your worth, he didn't deserve you. Sweet words from a man who proposed with a contract rather than poetry, Margaret teased. Would you have preferred poetry? Roses are red, violets are blue, I need a wife and you'll have to do? She laughed, the sound bright in the darkness. That's terrible. I'm a cattleman, not a poet. You're more than you think you are, she said seriously. One morning, Rosa came running from the kitchen, her face white with fear. Senora, riders coming, many riders, and they have torches. Margaret's blood went cold. Fire was every rancher's nightmare, especially with the buildings full of winter hay. She grabbed the rifle, calling for Samuel to ring the bell that would summon all hands. Elias and his men rode in hard from the far pastures, but Holloway's force had already surrounded the house. 20 men, all armed, several carrying torches that sparked ominously in the morning light. Last chance, Boone, Holloway called out. Sign over the land or we'll burn you out. You'd murder women and children? Elias demanded. Have you fallen that far? No murder necessary. You'll have time to evacuate, but the buildings, the stored feed, the fences, it'll all be ash. How will you make it through winter then? How many of your precious cattle will starve? Margaret could see Elias calculating, weighing lives against property. She knew what he was thinking, better to lose the land than risk her and Samuel. Before he could speak, she stepped onto the porch. Mr. Holloway, she called out, her teacher's voice carrying clearly, are you familiar with the new territorial statute regarding conspiracy to commit arson? Holloway laughed. You think to frighten me with legal threats? I own judges, remember? Perhaps. But you don't own federal marshals. Margaret held up a telegram, though her hands shook slightly. This arrived yesterday. Marshal Thompson from Denver will be here within the week to investigate reports of land fraud and criminal conspiracy. Your bought judges won't help you with federal charges. It was a bluff. The telegram was actually from her mother, another plea to return to Boston. But Margaret had learned to lie convincingly in the past weeks, her face revealing nothing. Holloway's expression darkened. "You're lying." "Am I? Can you afford to take that chance? Federal prison is quite different from the local jail, I'm told. And arson, especially resulting in death, carries significant sentences. You have no proof of anything. Don't I?" Margaret smiled coldly. "Your man Daniels has been quite talkative since we offered him a better salary. Written testimony about cut fences, poisoned water, and yes, the fire that killed Jake Morrison. All properly witnessed and notarized." This was partially true. Daniels had approached them, but he'd been too frightened to provide written testimony. Still, the seed of doubt was planted. She could see it in the way Holloway's men shifted uneasily, in the calculation behind Holloway's eyes. "This isn't over," he said finally. "Federal marshals can't stay forever, and accidents will continue to happen." "Then we'll continue to document them," Margaret replied. "Every incident, every threat, building a case that will eventually see you hanged or imprisoned. Is a piece of land worth that risk?" Holloway wheeled his horse around violently. "Pull back," he ordered his men. As they rode away, he looked back one more time. "You've made a powerful enemy, Mrs. Boone." "Good," she called after him. "I'd hate to waste my time on a weak one." Only when they were gone did Margaret's knees buckle. Elias caught her, holding her tight against him. "A federal marshal?" he asked quietly. "A useful fiction, but we should probably send for one now, to make it true." That was incredibly brave and incredibly foolish. It worked, didn't it? This time. He pulled back to look at her face. "Margaret, what you did. No one's ever fought for me like that before." "Then they were fools," she said simply. That night, the ranch celebrated cautiously. The immediate threat had passed, but everyone knew Holloway would regroup, find another angle. Still, Rosa cooked a feast. The hands brought out instruments, and for a few hours they pretended life was normal. Margaret danced with Elias in the barn, swaying to the fiddle music, his arms strong around her. "I never expected this," he murmured against her hair. "The dancing. You. The way you've changed everything. When I proposed that contract, I thought I was getting a business partner. Instead, I got—" "What?" she prompted when he paused. "Everything," he said simply. "You're everything, Margaret." The words were as close to a declaration of love as he'd come, and Margaret treasured them. "Elias, The barn door burst open. Tom Patterson stood there, his face grave. "Boss, you need to see this." They followed him outside to where a rider waited, not one of theirs. The man was barely staying in his saddle, blood staining his shirt. "Mr. Boone," he gasped. "Name's Collins. I worked for Holloway. He's lost his mind, sir. He's planning something terrible." "Get him inside," Elias ordered. "Rosa, we need hot water and bandages." As they tended the wounded man, his story emerged. Holloway, enraged by Margaret's defiance, had decided on a final solution. He'd hired a gang of outlaws, men with no connection to the area who wouldn't hesitate to kill. "When?" Elias demanded. "Tomorrow night, during the new moon when it's darkest. They plan to set fires at multiple points, create confusion, then—" Collins swallowed hard. "Then take Mrs. Boone." Holloway said if he can't have the land, he'll take something more valuable. Ice filled Margaret's veins. Beside her, Elias had gone completely still, the kind of stillness that preceded violence. "How many men?" he asked, his voice deadly quiet. 15, maybe 20. Professional killers, Mr. Boone. Not like the local boys he's been using." "Why warn us?" Margaret asked. "Why betray Holloway?" Collins looked at her with haunted eyes. "I signed on for intimidation, maybe some property damage. Not murder, not kidnapping women. My sister, something similar happened to her once. I couldn't be part of that." Elias stood abruptly. "Tom, gather the men. Send riders to town. Every man who owes me a favor, every hand looking for work. We're going to need an army." "Elias," Margaret began. "No." He turned to her, and she saw something wild in his eyes. "You're leaving. Tonight. I'll send you to town with an escort. We've had this discussion before. I'm not leaving. This is different. They're coming for you specifically. All the more reason to stay. If I run, they'll follow. At least here, we can choose our ground. Margaret, please. His voice broke on the word. I can't lose you. Not now. Not when I finally... He stopped, struggling with words that didn't come easily. Not when I finally found you. She reached up to cup his face, feeling the tremor in his jaw. Then we'd better make sure you don't. We have a day to prepare. Let's use it. The next 24 hours were controlled chaos. Men arrived from town, some friends of Elias, others simply citizens tired of Holloway's threats. By evening, they had 40 defenders, not professional fighters, but men willing to stand for what was right. Margaret organized the women, those who hadn't evacuated to town, into a medical corps, preparing bandages, boiling water, setting up a makeshift hospital in the main house. She also had another job, one she didn't share with Elias. As darkness fell, she slipped away to the barn where she'd hidden something days earlier, dynamite, purchased quietly from a miner passing through town. She'd remembered something from a book about the Civil War, about how defenders could even odds against superior forces. What are you doing? Samuel's voice made her jump. Something necessary. Help me, but don't tell your uncle. Together, they placed small charges at strategic points, not enough to destroy buildings, but enough to create confusion, to funnel attackers into kill zones. It was grim work, but Margaret had moved past squeamishness weeks ago. The attack came at midnight, announced by fire arrows arcing through the darkness. The hay barn erupted in flames, exactly as expected. But when Holloway's men rushed toward it, expecting panic, they met organized resistance. Gunfire erupted from prepared positions. Margaret, stationed at an upstairs window, picked her shots carefully, aiming to wound rather than kill when possible. Below, she could hear Elias shouting orders, his voice carrying over the chaos. Then came the second wave, riders charging the house itself. This was when Margaret detonated her first charge. The explosion threw horses and men to the ground, turning the charge into chaos. Through the smoke, she saw Holloway himself, recognizing his distinctive gray horse. "The woman!" he was shouting. "Find the woman!" Margaret moved to another window, continuing to fire, but she could see they were being overwhelmed. Despite their preparations, Holloway's killers were professionals. Already several defenders were down. Then she heard it, hoofbeats from the wrong direction. More riders, but whose? The answer came in the form of a badge glinting in the firelight. The federal marshal, not a fiction anymore. Someone, probably Rosa, had sent for help days ago. "Federal marshals!" The shout rang out. "Throw down your weapons!" The tide turned instantly. Holloway's hired killers had no loyalty worth dying for. They scattered into the darkness, leaving Holloway and a few diehards surrounded. Margaret made her way downstairs, needing to see the end of this. She found Elias facing Holloway, both men armed but not yet shooting. "It's over," Elias said. "Surrender to the marshals, Holloway. Maybe they'll be merciful." Holloway's laugh was bitter. "Merciful? I'm ruined either way, but I can still take payment for what you've cost me." He swung his gun toward Margaret. Time slowed. She saw Elias moving, knew he wouldn't be fast enough. Her own hand went to the small pistol she'd hidden in her skirts, a final protection she'd hoped not to need. 2 shots rang out almost simultaneously. Holloway's went wide, shattering a window behind Margaret. Hers didn't. Marcus Holloway looked down at the spreading red stain on his chest, surprise replacing rage on his face. "The schoolteacher," he gasped. "Killed by the schoolteacher." He fell forward, was still. Margaret stared at the gun in her hand, at the man she'd killed, and waited to feel something. Guilt, horror, satisfaction. Instead, there was only emptiness and Elias's arms around her, turning her away from the sight. "It's over," he murmured against her hair. "It's over." But it wasn't. Not quite. In the aftermath, as marshals took statements and arrested survivors, a locked box was found among Holloway's possessions. Inside were documents, including the real deed showing that Holloway's father had tried to buy the land from Elias's father 30 years ago. The sale had been refused. There was also a confession, written in Holloway's father's hand, admitting to murdering Thomas Boone when he wouldn't sell. "Your father was murdered," Margaret said quietly, showing Elias the paper. His face went white, then red, then settled into something like peace. All these years thinking it was an accident. At least now I know. The marshals left with their prisoners. The dead were buried. The ranch slowly returned to something approaching normal, though scars remained. Burned buildings to rebuild, fences to repair, grief for those lost. A month later, on Christmas Eve, Margaret stood in the kitchen teaching Rosa how to make Boston brown bread. Through the window, she could see Elias and Samuel working together, rebuilding the burned barn. The sight made her smile, then wince as a wave of nausea hit. "Señora?" Rosa's knowing eyes studied her. "You are well?" "I'm fine. Just tired." Rosa's hand went to Margaret's forehead, then boldly to her stomach. "How long since your monthly time?" Margaret flushed. "Rosa!" "Is important question. How long?" 6 weeks, maybe 7. Rosa's face split into a huge grin. "A baby! Oh, Señora, a Christmas miracle." "I'm not certain." "I am certain. I have seen many women with child. You have the look." Margaret sank into a chair, hand going to her still flat stomach. A baby. Elias's child. Their child. After all the violence and fear, this spark of new life seemed impossibly precious. That evening, she found Elias alone in his study, going over the ranch books. The fire cast warm light over his harsh features, softening them. He looked up when she entered, smiled, a real smile that transformed his face. "Margaret, come, see this. We're going to have our best year ever, despite everything. The Army contract for beef came through, and with Holloway's ranch being sold off, we can buy the water rights we've always needed." "Elias." She moved to stand beside his chair, suddenly nervous. "I have something to tell you." He turned to face her, concern replacing satisfaction. "What is it? Are you well?" We're going to have a baby." The words hung in the air like suspended snowflakes. Elias stared at her, his expression cycling through surprise, joy, and something that looked like fear. "A baby," he repeated. "You're certain?" "As certain as I can be without Doc Carter confirming, but Rosa seems sure, and my body, yes, I'm certain." Elias stood slowly, his hands going to her shoulders, then sliding down to rest gently on her stomach. "A baby, our baby." "Are you happy?" "Happy?" He pulled her against him, held her so tight she could barely breathe. "Margaret, I don't have words. When I proposed that contract, I hoped for children, yes, but I never thought I could feel this way." "What way?" He pulled back to look at her, and his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Complete. For the first time in my life, I feel complete." He kissed her then, soft and reverent. "I love you. I should have said it weeks ago, but I love you, Margaret, not as a business partner, not as the mother of my heir, but as you. My warrior woman who quotes Latin and shoots outlaws and makes me believe in something beyond survival. "Oh, Elias." Now Margaret was crying too. "I love you too. I think I have since you stood in my doorway with that ridiculous contract, so certain you could logic your way into marriage. It worked, didn't it?" "Not the way you planned." "No," he agreed. "So much better than I planned." The winter that followed was the hardest anyone in Redfern Ridge could remember. Snow fell for 3 straight days after Christmas, burying the valley in white silence that felt almost oppressive after the violence of the previous months. Margaret stood at the frost-covered window, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her stomach, watching Elias and his men struggle to break through the drifts to reach the cattle. "You shouldn't stand so long, Señora," Rosa chided, bringing her a cup of the peppermint tea that helped with the morning sickness that lasted well into afternoon. "The baby needs you to rest." "The baby needs its father to not work himself to death," Margaret countered, but she accepted the tea gratefully. Through the window, she could see Elias directing the operation to dig out the hay barn, his massive frame seeming diminished by the sheer scale of snow surrounding him. Samuel burst through the kitchen door, shaking snow from his coat like a wet dog. "Aunt Margaret, Uncle Elias says to tell you the Hendersons' roof collapsed. He's taking men to help dig them out." Margaret's heart clenched. The Henderson ranch was 5 miles away, through terrain that would be treacherous in this weather. Is anyone hurt? Don't know yet, but Uncle Elias said not to wait up. Could be late before they get back. She wanted to protest, to beg Elias to let others handle it, but she knew better. This was who he was, the man who took care of his community, who shouldered burdens others couldn't carry. It was one of the reasons she loved him, even as it terrified her. The hours crawled by. Margaret tried to focus on the household accounts, then on the letter she was writing to her mother about the pregnancy, but her attention kept drifting to the window. The sun set early, turning the snow-covered landscape into a study in blue shadows and silver highlights. Still no sign of the rescue party. "They'll be fine," Samuel said, though his own worry was evident in the way he kept finding reasons to pace past the windows. Uncle Elias knows these mountains better than anyone. But knowing the mountains didn't protect against avalanches or hidden ice or simple exhaustion, Margaret had learned enough about frontier life to understand how quickly tragedy could strike. She thought of Jake Morrison, dead before his 24th birthday, of Murphy still recovering from his burns, of all the ways this harsh land could claim those who challenged it. It was near midnight when she heard the horses. Margaret flew to the door, Rosa and Samuel close behind. The rescue party rode in slowly, several men slumped in their saddles. Elias was supporting Tom Patterson, who appeared to be unconscious. "Get Doc Carter," Elias commanded one of the hands who'd stayed behind. "Tom's leg is broke bad, and we need warming stations. Some of the men have frostbite." Margaret took charge of the triage, her months of frontier living having taught her basic medical skills. She directed Rosa to heat water, Samuel to gather blankets, while she herself tended to Tom's leg, keeping it stable until the doctor arrived. "The Hendersons?" she asked Elias quietly as she worked. "Safe. We got them out, but their barn is gone. Lost half their winter feed." He sat heavily on a bench, and for the first time Margaret noticed the exhaustion etched deep in his features. "I told them they could bring their stock here. We'll make our feed stretch somehow." "Can we afford that?" "Can't afford not to. If we don't stand together out here, we all fall separately." Doc Carter arrived within the hour, despite the treacherous roads. He set Tom's leg with efficient skill, then checked the other men for frostbite and exposure. When he reached Elias, he frowned. "How long were you out there?" 14 hours? Maybe 15? In this cold? You're lucky you didn't lose fingers. And this cough, how long have you had it?" "It's nothing," Elias dismissed, but Margaret heard the rasp in his chest that hadn't been there that morning. Doc Carter's expression was grave. "It's pneumonia waiting to happen if you don't rest. Complete bed rest for at least 3 days." "Can't. Too much work with the snow." "Elias Boone," Margaret interrupted, her teacher's voice brooking no argument. "You will go to bed right now, or I will have the men carry you there." He looked ready to argue, but something in her expression stopped him. Perhaps it was the way her hand went protectively to her stomach, reminding him of what was at stake. 3 days is impossible, he said finally. 1 day. I'll rest 1 day. 2, Margaret countered. Day and a half. Doc Carter shook his head. "You two negotiate everything like a business deal?" "It's what works for us," Margaret said, but she was smiling slightly. After everyone was settled and Doc Carter had left with promises to check on them tomorrow, Margaret found Elias in their bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed as if uncertain whether he was actually going to comply with the rest order. "Don't even think about it," she warned, beginning to unbutton his shirt. "You're staying in this bed if I have to tie you to it." "That sounds interesting," he murmured, but his attempt at levity was undermined by a harsh coughing fit. Margaret helped him out of his frozen clothes, noting with alarm how cold his skin was, how his usually steady hands shook slightly. She piled quilts on the bed, then slid in beside him, pressing her warmth against his chilled body. "You scared me tonight," she admitted in the darkness. "When you didn't come back." "I always come back." Jake Morrison probably thought the same thing. Elias was quiet for a moment, his arm tightening around her. "I can't promise nothing will happen to me, Margaret. This land, this life, it's dangerous. You knew that when you signed that contract." "I didn't know I'd love you then," she said simply. "I didn't know that losing you would feel like losing myself." He turned to face her, his hand finding her stomach where their child grew. I'll be more careful. For both of you. All three of us. 4, she corrected softly. 4? What? His eyes widened. Twins? Samuel. He's ours too, isn't he? Not by blood, but by choice. Elias's voice was rough with emotion when he answered. Yes. Yes, he is. The next morning brought a break in the weather, sun emerging to make the snow-covered world sparkle like diamond dust. But it also brought unexpected visitors. Margaret was trying to convince Elias to drink the beef broth Rosa had prepared when she heard sleigh bells approaching. Through the window, she saw an elegant sleigh drawn by matched black horses, incongruous against the rough ranch setting. The man who emerged was equally out of place, dressed in an expensive wool coat with fur collar, his boots polished despite the snow. "Who is that?" Margaret asked, but Elias had gone rigid beside her. "Charles Worthington," he said grimly. "My mother's brother. From Chicago." "You have family in Chicago?" "You never mentioned—" "Because he hasn't acknowledged my existence in 20 years, not since my mother died." Before Margaret could respond, Rosa was showing the visitor into their bedroom. Charles Worthington was everything Elias wasn't. Refined, elegant, with soft hands that had never known hard labor. But there was something in his gray eyes that reminded Margaret of Elias's storm cloud gaze. "Elias," Worthington said stiffly, "you look like death." "Charles, you look like you always did, like you'd rather be anywhere else." The two men stared at each other with barely concealed hostility. Margaret cleared her throat. "I'm Margaret, Elias's wife." "Welcome to our home, Mr. Worthington." Worthington's gaze shifted to her, taking in her simple dress, her work-roughened hands, the obvious swell of pregnancy. "The school teacher." "Yes, I heard about the marriage. Rather sudden, wasn't it?" "The best things often are," Margaret replied coolly. "Indeed." He returned his attention to Elias. "I've come about the estate." "What estate?" "Your grandmother's, my mother's. She died 2 months ago." Elias showed no emotion, but Margaret saw his knuckles whiten where he gripped the quilt. "The grandmother who disowned my mother for marrying a rancher?" "The same. However, she never actually removed Elizabeth from the will. Sentiment, perhaps, or simple oversight. Regardless, your mother's portion passes to you. $15,000 and some property in Chicago." The amount was staggering. Margaret saw Elias struggle to process it. This fortune dropping from the sky from a family that had rejected him. "I don't want it," Elias said flatly. "Don't be a fool," Worthington snapped. "I've seen this place." "You could use the money. God knows the old woman owes you something after how she treated Elizabeth." "She owes me nothing. I built what I have without her help. I don't need her guilt money now." Margaret recognized the stubborn set of his jaw and intervened. "Mr. Worthington, perhaps you could give us time to discuss this. You must be tired from your journey. Rosa can show you to a guest room." Worthington looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Margaret's tone brooked no refusal. After he left, she turned to Elias. $15,000. Blood money. Money that could rebuild the Hendersons' barn, could buy extra feed to get everyone through winter, could ensure our child has every opportunity. She touched his face gently. "Your pride won't keep anyone warm, Elias. You don't understand. My mother begged them for help when my father was starting the ranch. Just a small loan to get through the first winter. They refused. Said she'd made her choice. She died still hoping they'd forgive her. Then take the money as justice for her. Use it to build the legacy she wanted." He was quiet for a long time, staring at the ceiling. Outside, she could hear Charles Worthington's cultured voice directing someone about his luggage. Finally, Elias spoke. "You're going to be a formidable mother. Our child won't get away with anything. Is that a yes to the money?" "It's a maybe. But first I want to know why he really came. Charles Worthington wouldn't travel to Wyoming in winter just to deliver news that could have come by letter." The answer came at dinner. Margaret had insisted Elias stay in bed, but Worthington joined her and Samuel at the table. After Rosa served the meal, Worthington set down his fork and looked directly at Margaret. "I came to make you an offer," he said. Both of you, but I suspect you're the practical one. What kind of offer? Margaret asked warily. Come to Chicago. Not permanently, but for a year, maybe two. I'm expanding my business interests into Western beef. I need someone who understands ranching to oversee that division. Elias has the knowledge, and you, Mrs. Boone, have the refinement to navigate Chicago's society. You want Elias to work for you? With me. He'd be a partner eventually. The salary would be substantial, plus housing in one of the better neighborhoods. Your child would have access to the finest schools, the best opportunities. Margaret felt a traitorous flutter of interest. Chicago. Theaters, libraries, sophisticated conversation. The things she'd missed from her old life. But then she thought of Elias, who was mountain and prairie-made flesh, trying to exist in drawing rooms and offices. Why? She asked. Why this offer now? Worthington was quiet for a moment. I'm 63 years old, Mrs. Boone. I have no children, no heir. Elias is my only family, whether we like it or not. I was wrong to follow my mother's lead in cutting ties. This is my attempt to make amends. And if Elias refuses, then I go back to Chicago alone and you never hear from me again. He stood. I'll stay until the weather clears. Think about it. Later, Margaret relayed the conversation to Elias. His reaction was predictable. Absolutely not. I'm not leaving the ranch. I'm not saying we should, but shouldn't we at least consider it? There's nothing to consider. This is our home. This is your home, Margaret corrected gently. I'm still learning to make it mine. He looked at her sharply. You want to go to Chicago? No. Maybe. I don't know. She sank onto the bed beside him. Sometimes I miss it, the culture, the refinement. Does that make me ungrateful? It makes you honest. He pulled her against him. What I can offer you, it's not what you were raised for. What you offer me is worth more than all the theaters in Chicago, she said firmly. But Elias, what if this is an opportunity for Samuel? He could attend university there, learn business skills to help the ranch grow. Samuel belongs here. Does he? Or have you just decided that for him, the way your life was decided by circumstance? It was a hard truth, and Elias didn't answer immediately. Finally, he said, We'll ask him. Let him be part of the decision. Samuel's response surprised them all. At dinner the next night, with Worthington present, the boy listened to the Chicago offer thoughtfully, then said, Could I go alone? For school, I mean. Live with Mr. Worthington during the school year, come back summers? Elias looked thunderstruck. You want to leave? Not leave. Learn. Aunt Margaret's been teaching me about the bigger world. I want to see it, understand it. Then I can come back and help the ranch even more. Worthington leaned forward. I'd be honored to sponsor your education, Samuel. Your family, after all. Margaret watched Elias struggle with this. The boy he'd raised like a son, wanting to fly beyond the boundaries Elias had set. It was every parent's challenge, happening sooner than expected. You're only 15, Elias said finally. 16 in 2 months, old enough to make decisions about my future. The ranch needs you. The ranch needs someone who understands more than cattle and weather, Samuel countered, unconsciously echoing Margaret's earlier arguments. It needs someone who can negotiate with the army, work with banks, maybe even deal with politicians. I can't learn that here. The conversation continued late into the night, voices rising and falling with emotion. Margaret mediated when necessary, but mostly let them work through it themselves. Worthington, to his credit, stayed largely silent, letting the family sort through their feelings. In the end, it was decided that Samuel would go to Chicago for the fall semester, starting in September. If it went well, he could continue. If not, he could come home. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but everyone could live with. The weather cleared after a week, and Worthington prepared to leave. Before his departure, he found Margaret alone in the kitchen. You're good for him, he said simply. Elias, you soften his edges without weakening him. He's good for me, too. He gives me strength I didn't know I had. The offer stands, you know. If you ever change your minds about Chicago, we won't. But thank you. Worthington smiled slightly. My mother would have hated you. Too independent, too forthright. Elizabeth would have loved you for exactly the same reasons. He left that afternoon, his elegant sleigh incongruous to the last against the rough ranch setting. Elias stood on the porch watching him go, Margaret beside him. "Do you regret not going?" she asked. "No." "Do you regret staying?" "Never." She took his hand, placed it on her growing stomach. "This child will be born on this land, raised on this land. That's worth more than any city could offer." Spring came late but sudden, the snow melting in a rush that turned creeks into torrents and roads into mud. With it came both relief and new challenges. The cattle had survived the winter, though losses were higher than usual. The Hendersons, using part of the inheritance money Elias had finally accepted, rebuilt their barn. The community slowly healed from the wounds Holloway had inflicted. Margaret's pregnancy progressed, her body changing in ways that amazed and sometimes frustrated her. She could no longer ride, could barely manage the stairs some days. But feeling the baby move, their child, hers and Elias's, made every discomfort worthwhile. One afternoon in May, she was sitting on the porch watching Elias work with a new colt when she felt the first pain. It was mild, easily dismissed. But an hour later, another came, stronger. "Rosa," she called, trying to keep her voice calm. "I think it's time." What followed was 14 hours of labor that tested every reserve of strength Margaret possessed. Elias paced the hallway outside their bedroom like a caged wolf, flinching at every cry of pain. Doc Carter had been summoned but was delayed by a difficult birth at another ranch. "Can't wait much longer," Rosa said, her face grave. "The baby comes now." Margaret gripped the headboard, bearing down with everything she had. The pain was beyond description, but beneath it was determination. She'd survived scandal, loneliness, a range war. She would survive this too. "I see the head," Rosa exclaimed. "Once more, Senora, once more." With a final tremendous effort, Margaret brought their child into the world. The baby's cry, strong and angry, was the sweetest sound she'd ever heard. "A son," Rosa announced, cleaning the infant quickly before placing him in Margaret's arms. A big, healthy son. Margaret stared down at the tiny face, already seeing Elias in the shape of his nose, the determined set of his jaw even in infancy. "Tell Elias," she whispered. "Tell him he has a son." But Elias was already there, having burst through the door at the baby's first cry. He approached the bed slowly, as if afraid he might break something. When he saw the baby in Margaret's arms, his face transformed with wonder. "A son," he breathed. "Our son." "What shall we name him?" Margaret asked, shifting so Elias could sit beside them. "Thomas," Elias said without hesitation. "After my father, Thomas Samuel Boone." "Thomas Samuel," Margaret repeated, touching the baby's impossibly soft cheek. "Welcome to the world, little one. You've been born into quite a legacy." Doc Carter arrived an hour later, pronouncing both mother and child healthy. Samuel, who'd been banished to the barn during the birth, was finally allowed in. He approached tentatively, this almost man who'd soon leave for Chicago. "Your cousin," Margaret told him, though they all knew the relationships were more complex than blood could define. Samuel touched the baby's tiny fist, his face soft with wonder. "He's so small." "He'll grow," Elias said, his arm around Samuel's shoulders. "With you to teach him when you come back from Chicago, he'll grow strong and smart." "You think I should still go? Even with the baby?" "Especially with the baby. He'll need the kind of man you're going to become." The summer passed in a blur of infant care and ranch work. Margaret learned to nurse while reviewing accounts, to soothe a crying baby while planning meals for the hands. She was exhausted, but exhilarated, feeling more alive than she had in years. The ranch prospered. The Army contract Elias had secured proved even more lucrative than expected. They hired more hands, including some of Holloway's former workers who'd been left unemployed by his death and the dissolution of his ranch. It was Elias's way, turning former enemies into allies through fair wages and honest work. One evening in August, as they prepared for Samuel's departure to Chicago, Margaret found Elias standing in what had been Samuel's room, now being prepared as a nursery for when Thomas was older. "Having second thoughts?" she asked. "Every minute." But you were right. He needs to see beyond these mountains. He'll come back. This land is in his blood, just like it's in yours. And yours? Elias asked, pulling her against him. Is it in your blood now? Margaret thought about the woman she'd been 2 years ago, refined, educated, but ultimately purposeless. Then she looked at who she'd become. Mother, wife, ranch woman who could shoot a rifle and birth a calf and face down outlaws. It's in my blood, my bones, my soul, she said. This land, this life, it's all part of me now. No regrets about the contract marriage? She laughed. The contract was just the beginning. What we built from it, that's the real marriage. And it's good? It's perfect. Perfectly imperfect, perfectly challenging, perfectly ours. September came too quickly. They loaded Samuel's trunks onto the wagon for the journey to the train station. He looked older already, dressed in the city clothes Worthington had sent, but his eyes were the same, eager, intelligent, ready for adventure. You'll write, Margaret said. Not a question, but a command. Every week, Samuel promised. And you'll study hard. Yes, Aunt Margaret. And remember who you are, where you come from. How could I forget? He hugged her tight, then bent to kiss baby Thomas's head. Take care of him. Teach him everything you taught me. The farewell with Elias was harder to watch. The two stood facing each other, these men who'd been father and son in all but blood, trying to find words for emotions they'd rarely expressed. I'm proud of you, Elias said finally. Your parents would be too. You gave me everything, Samuel replied, his voice breaking slightly. You and Aunt Margaret. I'll make you proud. I promise. You already have, son. You already have. They watched the wagon disappear down the road, Samuel turning to wave until he was out of sight. Margaret felt Elias shaking beside her and knew it wasn't from cold. He'll be back, she said softly. I know, but he won't be the same. Neither will we. That's what growth is, changing but staying rooted. That night, as they lay in bed with Thomas sleeping between them, Elias said, I've been thinking about what Worthington said. About the future of ranching. Oh. The old ways won't last forever. Men like Holloway proved that. We need to be smarter, more connected. Maybe start an association of ranchers, work together instead of apart. Margaret smiled in the darkness. That sounds like progress. That sounds like your influence. We influence each other. That's what partners do. As autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and red, life settled into new rhythms. Letters from Samuel arrived weekly, full of excitement about his classes, the city, the wider world he was discovering. Margaret read them aloud at dinner, and even the ranch hands listened eagerly, hungry for news from beyond their isolated valley. Thomas grew with astonishing speed, his gray eyes tracking everything, his tiny hands grasping at whatever came near. He had his father's stubborn nature, crying until he got what he wanted, but also Margaret's curiosity, always alert to new sounds and sights. One evening, as the first snow of the season began to fall, Margaret stood at the window watching it cover the land in fresh white. Elias came up behind her, arms wrapping around her waist, his chin resting on her head. Another winter, he said. Our third together. Feels like a lifetime. Feels like yesterday. Both, Margaret agreed. She turned in his arms to face him. That day you came to my door with your contract. Did you imagine this? Never. I thought I was making a business arrangement. Instead, I got a life I didn't know I could have. We both did. Through the window, she could see the ranch spreading out below them, the buildings they'd rebuilt after Holloway's attacks, the herd settled for the night, the vast land that had tested and shaped them. It was harsh, this life, demanding everything and promising nothing except what you could carve from it with will and work. But it was also beautiful in its severity, honest in its challenges. There were no pretenses here, no false courtesies, just truth and earth and sky, and the family they'd built from a contract that had become a covenant. I love you, she said, words that still felt new despite months of saying them. I love you too, he replied, and kissed her with the same intensity as that first night when they'd both been too stubborn to admit what was growing between them. Baby Thomas stirred in his cradle, making the soft sounds that preceded crying. Margaret moved to tend him, but Elias stopped her. "Let me," he said, picking up his son with hands that could break a horse or forge iron, but held the infant with infinite gentleness. "Hey there, little man. Looking at the snow? This is your first winter, but there'll be many more. This land will teach you like it taught me, like it taught your mother. It'll be hard sometimes, but we'll be here." Family stands together. Watching him with their son, Margaret felt complete in a way she'd never imagined possible. The lonely schoolteacher was gone, replaced by a woman who'd found her place, her purpose, her people. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the scars of past battles, preparing the earth for spring's eventual return. Inside, the fire crackled, the baby cooed, and Elias began telling him the story of how his parents met. A giant cowboy with a business proposal and a lonely teacher with hidden strength. It wasn't the life Margaret had planned, but it was the life she'd chosen, fought for, and won. And as she joined her husband and son by the fire, adding her voice to the story, she knew there was nowhere else she'd rather be. The contract that had brought them together lay forgotten in Elias's desk drawer, its carefully negotiated terms superseded by something far more binding: love, trust, and the family they'd built from the ashes of their separate lonelinesses. They'd started as strangers making a bargain, but they'd become something more, something that no contract could define or contain. They were home. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, when Thomas was 9 months old and had just taken his first wobbling steps across the kitchen floor. Margaret was on her knees, arms outstretched to catch him if he fell, when Rosa brought in the mail from town. The envelope bore the seal of Worthington Industries, but the handwriting wasn't Charles's careful script. "What is it?" Elias asked, seeing her face pale as she read. "Samuel's been hurt," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There was an accident at one of Worthington's factories. A boiler explosion. Charles says he's alive, but—" She handed him the letter with trembling fingers. Elias read quickly, his jaw tightening with each line. "Badly burned. May lose the use of his left arm. Asking for us." He set the letter down carefully, as if it might explode. "We leave tomorrow. The ranch. Tom can manage things. Our boy needs us." The journey to Chicago took 5 days by train, 5 days of barely controlled panic masked as calm for Thomas's sake. Margaret had never seen Elias so agitated, pacing their compartment like a caged animal, his hands clenching and unclenching as if he could fight their way to Samuel's side faster than the locomotive could carry them. Chicago was a shock after years in Wyoming. The buildings rose like mountains of brick and steel. The streets teemed with more people than lived in all of Redfern Ridge, and the air tasted of coal smoke and progress. Charles Worthington met them at the station, looking older than when he'd visited the ranch, his face drawn with worry. "How is he?" were Elias's first words. "Alive, awake, asking for you constantly." Charles led them to a waiting carriage. "The doctors say the scarring will be significant, and his left arm. They wanted to amputate, but I wouldn't let them, not without your consent." Margaret felt her stomach lurch. Samuel, their bright, ambitious boy, maimed before his 17th birthday. What happened exactly? He was touring the factory as part of his business education. The boiler hadn't been properly maintained. My oversight, my fault. When it exploded, Samuel pushed 2 workers out of the way. He saved their lives, but the steam— Charles's voice broke. The steam caught him full on his left side. The hospital was a modern facility, all white tiles and the sharp smell of carbolic acid. They found Samuel in a private room, swathed in bandages from shoulder to wrist on his left side, more bandages covering part of his face and neck. His eyes, when they opened at their entrance, were dulled with laudanum, but sparked with recognition. "Uncle Elias," he whispered. "Aunt Margaret. You came." "Of course we came," Margaret said, fighting tears as she carefully took his unbandaged right hand. "Oh, my dear boy." "I'm sorry," Samuel said, tears leaking from his eyes. "I've ruined everything. Can't work the ranch like this. Can't be what you need me to be." "Stop that," Elias said firmly, though his own eyes were suspiciously bright. You saved 2 lives. You're a hero and you're alive. Everything else we'll figure out. They stayed in Chicago for 2 months, taking rooms near the hospital. Margaret spent her days at Samuel's bedside, reading to him, helping him with the excruciating physical therapy once the bandages came off, being strong when he wanted to give up. The scarring was indeed significant, his left arm twisted and weakened, the left side of his face marked with puckered red tissue that would fade to white with time but never disappear. Elias divided his time between Samuel and surprising meetings with Charles Worthington. Margaret discovered this when she returned early from the hospital one day to find them deep in discussion over documents spread across the dining table. "What's this?" she asked. Elias looked almost guilty. "Charles has a proposition." "Another one?" "A partnership," Charles explained, "not asking Elias to leave the ranch, but to help coordinate beef contracts for my restaurants and hotels. He could do it mostly from Wyoming, with perhaps 2 trips to Chicago per year." "Why?" Margaret asked, suspicious of this sudden generosity. "Because I nearly killed my great-nephew through negligence," Charles said bluntly. "Because I'm getting older and need someone I trust to handle this side of the business. Because families shouldn't be strangers, regardless of old grudges." Margaret looked at Elias. "What do you think?" "I think Samuel's medical bills will be substantial. I think having connections in Chicago could help the ranch long term. I think—" He paused, meeting her eyes. "I think sometimes pride needs to take second place to practicality." It was a massive concession from the man who'd initially refused his inheritance out of principle. Margaret felt a rush of love for him, for his ability to change, to grow, to put family above stubborn independence. When they finally brought Samuel home to Wyoming, the entire community turned out to welcome him. If anyone stared at his scars or noticed his weakened arm, they kept it to themselves. This was the frontier where everyone bore marks of survival. But Samuel had changed in more ways than physical. The confident boy who'd left for Chicago had been replaced by a young man who flinched from mirrors and kept to his room. Margaret watched him struggle, saw Elias's helplessness in the face of wounds that couldn't be healed with hard work or determination. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. They'd hired a new school teacher to replace Margaret, a young woman named Catherine Marsh from Vermont. She was plain, practical, and possessed of a sharp tongue that reminded Margaret of herself at that age. She also didn't treat Samuel any differently because of his injuries. "Your nephew's been moping around town," Catherine told Margaret one day after church. "It's unseemly. He's been through trauma. We've all been through trauma, Mrs. Boone. It's how we handle it that defines us." Catherine's brown eyes were fierce. "He's letting those scars define him instead of refine him." Margaret bristled at the criticism, but recognized truth in it. "What would you suggest?" "Give him purpose. He can't ranch physically, but that mind of his is still sharp. Have him teach, help with the school. Heaven knows I could use assistance with the older students." It was Samuel who resisted the idea at first. "Look at me," he said bitterly when Margaret suggested it. "What child would want to learn from a monster?" "You're not a monster," Margaret said firmly. "You're a hero who bears the marks of his heroism. And children need to learn that strength comes in many forms." Slowly, reluctantly, Samuel began helping at the school. At first just with bookkeeping and supplies, then gradually with lessons. The children, after their initial curiosity about his scars, accepted him with the casual adaptability of youth. And Catherine Marsh, with her sharp tongue and sharper mind, drew him out of his self-pity through sheer persistent challenge. Margaret watched their friendship develop with interest that turned to delight, when she realized it was becoming something more. The way Samuel's eyes followed Catherine, the way she found excuses to visit the ranch with questions about curriculum that she could easily answer herself. "She's courting him," Margaret told Elias one evening as they watched Catherine and Samuel walking together near the creek, Thomas toddling between them. "Good. He needs someone who sees past the scars. She's strong enough for him. Strong enough for this life." "Like another school teacher I knew once," Elias said, pulling her close. That summer brought prosperity, but also new challenges. The partnership with Worthington proved lucrative, bringing contracts that benefited not just the Boone Ranch, but smaller operations in the area. Elias had kept his word about forming a ranchers' association, and now they negotiated as a group, preventing the kind of exploitation Holloway had represented. But prosperity brought attention. The railroad announced plans to extend a spur line through the valley, which would make shipping cattle easier, but would also bring development, change, the gradual erosion of the frontier life they knew. Progress, Elias said the word like it tasted bitter. They call it progress. It is progress, Margaret argued. Think what it means for medical care, for education, for opportunities. For people who want to change us into something we're not. They were standing on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. Thomas played at their feet, building towers with wooden blocks Elias had carved for him. In the distance, they could see the surveyors' flags marking where the railroad would run. Change isn't always bad, Margaret said gently. We're proof of that. We changed each other, and we're better for it. That's different, is it? You were set in your ways, convinced you needed only a business arrangement. I was hiding from life, convinced I'd never have a family. We both changed, adapted, grew. The ranch can do the same. Before Elias could respond, they heard horses approaching fast. Tom Patterson rode in, his face grim. Boss, we've got trouble. Rustlers hit the Hendersons again. Took 50 head this time. The same group? Looks like it. Professional job, not local boys. There had been a series of rustling incidents over the past month, each more bold than the last. The local sheriff seemed unable or unwilling to stop them, and suspicion was growing that someone was paying him to look the other way. Gather the men, Elias ordered. We ride tonight. Elias, no, Margaret protested. Let the law handle it. What law? Sheriff Clayton's as useful as a screen door in winter. If we don't protect ourselves, no one will. It was the Holloway situation all over again, but this time Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something was different, more dangerous. These weren't local disputes over land rights, but professional criminals, possibly connected to larger operations back east. Then I'm coming with you, she said. Absolutely not. You have Thomas to think of. And he needs his father alive. I'm a better shot than half your men, and you know it. They argued fiercely but briefly, time being precious. In the end, Margaret won by simple stubbornness, leaving Thomas with Rosa and Samuel while she rode out with the posse. They tracked the rustlers through the night, following a trail that led into the Badlands where the law rarely ventured. Dawn found them overlooking a canyon where the stolen cattle were being held, guarded by a dozen men who looked nothing like common thieves. Those are military rifles, Tom observed quietly. And that's a telegraph line running to their camp. This isn't just rustling. It's organized crime, Elias agreed. Question is, who's behind it? They got their answer when a familiar figure emerged from the largest tent. Margaret's blood went cold. Marcus Holloway's younger brother, Vincent, who disappeared after Marcus's death and was thought to have fled the territory. Should have known a Holloway was involved, Elias muttered. He's got twice our numbers, Tom pointed out, and better armed. But we have surprise, Margaret said. And something else. She pointed to the narrow canyon walls. Remember the dynamite I used during the first fight with Marcus? I brought more. Elias looked at her with a mixture of admiration and exasperation. You brought explosives on a tracking expedition? I've learned to be prepared for anything living with you. They split into 3 groups. Tom would create a distraction from the east, Elias would hit from the west, and Margaret would position herself above with the dynamite, ready to seal the canyon if things went badly. The attack began at full daylight. Tom's group opened fire, drawing the rustlers' attention. When they rushed to defend that position, Elias attacked from the opposite side. In the confusion, Margaret lit her first charge and rolled it down the canyon wall. The explosion panicked the cattle, who stampeded through the camp, adding to the chaos. Margaret placed her shots carefully, aiming to wound rather than kill when possible. She saw Vincent Holloway trying to rally his men, his face twisted with the same rage that had consumed his brother. Then everything went wrong. One of the rustlers had circled behind Margaret's position. She heard the cock of a rifle behind her and turned, knowing she was too late. The shot that rang out wasn't from the rustler's gun. Samuel stood 20 feet away, his weakened left arm supported by Catherine, who helped him hold the rifle steady. The rustler fell, clutching his shoulder. Thought you might need backup, Aunt Margaret, Samuel said with a ghost of his old grin. The tide turned quickly after that. Faced with attacks from multiple directions and the psychological impact of the explosions, the rustlers surrendered. Vincent Holloway tried to escape, but was brought down by Tom's lasso, a fitting end for a would-be cattle baron. This time, federal marshals were already on their way, alerted by telegrams Margaret had sent before they rode out. The rustling operation was indeed part of a larger criminal enterprise, and its disruption earned the gratitude of authorities and ranchers alike. "You sent for marshals before we even found them?" Elias asked Margaret later. "I had a feeling we'd need official support." "The days of handling everything ourselves are passing, Elias. We need to work within the law, not outside it." "When did you become so wise?" "When I married a stubborn rancher who needed someone to save him from himself." That fall brought 2 weddings. First, Samuel and Catherine married in a simple ceremony at the church, Samuel standing proud despite his scars, Catherine looking at him like he hung the moon. Watching them exchange vows, Margaret remembered her own wedding to Elias, how far they'd all come from those awkward, contractual beginnings. The second wedding was Tom Patterson to Rosa, a match that surprised no one who'd seen them together over the years. The celebration lasted 3 days, with the entire valley participating, a testament to how the community had healed and grown stronger after its trials. Winter arrived with less drama than previous years, though it brought its own changes. The railroad construction reached the valley, bringing workers who needed feeding. Elias negotiated contracts to supply beef to the construction camps, deals that would secure the ranch's prosperity for years to come. Thomas grew rapidly, a miniature version of his father in stubbornness, but with his mother's quick mind. He followed Samuel everywhere when his cousin was home from teaching, fascinated by the books and stories Samuel shared. Margaret often found the 3 of them, Samuel, Catherine, and Thomas, huddled together over some text, creating an impromptu classroom in the ranch house kitchen. One evening in December, as snow fell softly outside, Margaret realized she was pregnant again. The knowledge filled her with joy and a touch of fear. She was 37 now, older for childbearing, especially on the frontier. "Another baby," Elias said when she told him, his face cycling through surprise to joy to concern. "Are you sure? Is it safe?" "Doc Carter says I'm healthy as a horse, if not quite as young as one. Women have babies at my age all the time." "Not women who fight rustlers and blow up canyons. That was months ago. Besides, this baby will be born into a more peaceful world. The rustlers are gone, the railroad's bringing civilization, Samuel's found happiness despite everything. We're building something lasting here." Elias pulled her into his arms, his hand splaying protectively over her still flat stomach. "Another child. Our children will grow up differently than we did, with education, opportunities, choices. But with the same values," Margaret added, "hard work, integrity, courage. The things that matter don't change just because the world around us does." As winter deepened, life settled into new patterns. The ranch operated more efficiently than ever, with Tom as foreman and Elias able to focus on the business side, especially the partnership with Worthington. Samuel had taken over much of the bookkeeping, his injured arm preventing physical labor, but his mind sharp as ever. Catherine had transformed the school into one of the best in the territory, drawing families to settle in the area. Margaret found herself at the center of it all, managing the household, teaching Thomas his letters, helping Catherine with curriculum, maintaining the correspondence that kept their various business ventures connected. She'd become what she'd never expected, a frontier matriarch, respected and relied upon by an entire community. One night, unable to sleep due to the baby's movement, she stood at the window watching snow fall on the land that had become her world. Elias joined her, wrapping a blanket around them both. "Regrets?" he asked, a question that had become almost ritual between them. "Never," she answered, as she always did, but this time she added, "I was thinking about that woman who stood in a shabby cottage, reading your contract, terrified but trying not to show it. And? I wish I could tell her it would be all right. More than all right, wonderful, terrible, challenging, perfect, everything she was afraid to hope for. What would she say?" Margaret smiled. "She'd probably think I was lying. That kind of happiness seemed impossible then. And now? Now it seems inevitable, like everything that happened, The contract, Holloway, the fire, Samuel's injury, all of it was leading us here, to this moment, this life. Spring came with the birth of their daughter, Elizabeth Rosa Boone, named for both grandmothers. The labor was harder than with Thomas, Margaret's age showing, but she was strong from years of ranch life, and the baby arrived healthy and loud, with her mother's dark hair and her father's gray eyes. A daughter, Elias said wonderingly, holding the tiny bundle with the same gentleness he'd shown with Thomas. I don't know anything about raising daughters. You'll learn, Margaret said tiredly but happily. We both will. Samuel and Catherine were the first visitors, bringing Thomas to meet his sister. The little boy stared at the baby with fascination, then announced, She's very small. Can we keep her? Yes, Margaret laughed. We can keep her. As spring turned to summer, the railroad finally reached Redfern Ridge. The first train arrival was a celebration, with dignitaries from Denver and even a photographer to document the occasion. Elias stood with the other leading citizens, looking uncomfortable in his formal suit, but recognizing the necessity of adaptation. You clean up well, Margaret told him, adjusting his tie. I feel like a dressed-up bull at a county fair. You look distinguished, like the successful businessman you've become. I'm still just a rancher, Margaret. No, she corrected. You're a rancher who's learned to be more. Just like I'm a teacher who's learned to be more. We've both become what we needed to become. The photographer positioned them for a formal portrait. Elias and Margaret seated, Samuel and Catherine standing behind them, Thomas on Margaret's lap and baby Elizabeth in Elias's arms. As the flash powder exploded, capturing the moment, Margaret thought about how this image would look to future generations. Would they see the struggles, the pain, the growth that had brought them to this point? Or just another frontier family, posed and proper? One more, the photographer called. Less formal this time. As he prepared his camera again, Thomas squirmed free and ran to chase a butterfly. Samuel laughed, his scarred face creasing with genuine joy. Catherine smiled at her husband with open adoration. Elizabeth began crying, and Elias bounced her gently, making ridiculous faces to soothe her. Margaret watched her family with overwhelming love, and that's when the photographer captured them. Not posed, not perfect, but real. That evening, after the celebration had ended and the dignitary speeches about progress and prosperity had been forgotten, the family gathered on the porch as they did most evenings. Samuel read aloud from a letter from Charles Worthington, updating them on business matters but also sharing personal observations about life and regret and the importance of family. He's lonely, Catherine observed. Perhaps we should invite him to visit. He's always welcome, Elias said, surprising Margaret with his easy acceptance of the man he'd once considered an enemy. As darkness fell, they moved inside. Rosa had prepared a special dinner to celebrate the railroad's arrival, but the conversation was the same as always: ranch business, town gossip, plans for the future. Thomas fell asleep at the table, his head pillowed on his arms. Elizabeth fussed until Margaret nursed her, the baby settling with contented sighs. We should put the children to bed, Margaret said, but nobody moved. These moments were too precious, this gathering of souls who'd found each other through contract and circumstance, but stayed together through choice and love. Tell us the story again, Samuel said suddenly, about the contract. You know that story, Elias protested. Thomas doesn't. Not really. And someday Elizabeth will want to know, so Elias began, his deep voice filling the room. It was November, unseasonably warm for Wyoming. I'd been thinking about the future, about legacy. Margaret listened, adding her own perspective when Elias's version strayed too far from fact. Samuel and Catherine interjected with questions, making the story interactive, alive. Thomas woke briefly, listened with sleepy interest, then dozed again. Elizabeth slept on, peaceful in her mother's arms. As the story wound toward its conclusion, their present moment, Margaret felt a deep satisfaction. They'd built something extraordinary from the humblest beginning. Not just a ranch or a fortune, but a family that would endure beyond any of them. And then what happened? Thomas mumbled, half awake. Then, Margaret said softly, they lived. They worked and struggled and loved and fought and made peace. They raised children and buried friends and watched the world change around them. They lived, fully and completely, holding nothing back. "Is that the end?" the boy asked. "No," Elias said, his eyes meeting Margaret's across the room. "It's just another beginning." Outside, a train whistle echoed through the valley, symbol of the new world approaching. But inside the ranch house, surrounded by 3 generations bound by blood and choice, the important things remained unchanged: love, family, home. The years that followed the railroad's arrival brought changes that transformed Redfern Ridge from a frontier outpost into a proper town. Margaret watched it happen from her vantage point at the ranch, noting each new building, each fresh face, with a mixture of pride and nostalgia. By the time Thomas turned 8 and Elizabeth 6, the town boasted 2 hotels, 3 saloons, a newspaper office, and even a small bank where Elias now served on the board of directors. It was a morning in late September when everything changed again. Margaret was teaching Elizabeth her numbers at the kitchen table while Thomas practiced his Latin declensions, groaning dramatically at each correction. Elias had ridden to town early for a board meeting, and Samuel was at the schoolhouse with Catherine, who was expecting their first child after years of trying. The sound of multiple horses approaching made Margaret look up. Through the window, she saw a group of well-dressed men, their Eastern clothing as out of place as their polished carriages. At their head rode a man she recognized from newspaper illustrations, James Harrison, the railroad magnate who controlled half the transportation in the West. "Thomas, take your sister upstairs," Margaret said quietly. The boy, sensing tension, obeyed without argument. Margaret met the men on the porch, rifle within reach but not displayed. She'd learned to project strength without immediate threat, a delicate balance that had served her well. "Mrs. Boone," Harrison tipped his hat. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 40, with shrewd eyes that assessed everything. "I apologize for arriving unannounced. Is your husband available?" "He's in town." "What's your business here, Mr. Harrison?" His eyebrows rose at her directness. "You know who I am." "Everyone knows who you are. The question is why you're on my land." "Straight to business. I like that." He dismounted, his men remaining on their horses. "I want to buy your ranch, Mrs. Boone. All of it." Margaret kept her expression neutral, though her heart raced. "It's not for sale." "Everything's for sale at the right price. I'm prepared to offer 5 times its current value." The number he named was staggering, enough to make them wealthy beyond imagining, but Margaret thought of Elias, who'd built this place with his father's dreams and his own sweat. Of Samuel, scarred but determined, helping run what would someday be his inheritance. Of her children, born on this land, meant to grow from it. "No amount of money would be enough, Mr. Harrison." "That's what they all say initially." His smile was cold. "But I need this land for the new spur line to Denver. The route through your valley is the only practical option." "Then you'll have to find an impractical option." Harrison's friendly facade cracked slightly. "Mrs. Boone, I'm trying to be civilized about this. But one way or another, that rail line is going through. You can profit from it or be crushed by it." "Are you threatening me, Mr. Harrison?" "I'm explaining reality." "Then let me explain ours," Margaret said, steel entering her voice. "This ranch has survived Indian raids, range wars, rustlers, and Marcus Holloway. My husband and I didn't build this life to sell it to the highest bidder. Now get off our land." Harrison remounted, his face hard. "You're making a mistake." "I don't lose, Mrs. Boone, ever." After they left, Margaret immediately sent Tom to town to fetch Elias. She also sent riders to Samuel and to their nearest neighbors. If Harrison was serious about his threat, they'd need allies. Elias returned within the hour, his face grim. Harrison approached the bank board first, offered to buy out everyone's mortgages if they'd pressure us to sell. What did the board say? "Split vote. Some want the money, others remember what we've done for this community." He pulled her close. "This is different from Holloway, Margaret. Harrison has resources we can't match. Then we have to be smarter." That evening, they held a war council in the parlor. Samuel and Catherine came, along with Tom and Rosa, and surprisingly, Charles Worthington, who'd arrived on the afternoon train for one of his quarterly visits. "Harrison's done this before," Charles said, his knowledge of Eastern business practices invaluable. He identifies key properties, applies pressure through banks and government, and eventually gets what he wants. Not this time, Samuel said fiercely, his scarred hand clenching. This ranch is our children's inheritance. All our children, Catherine added, her hand on her swollen belly. The question is how we fight someone with unlimited resources, Elias said. We use the law, Margaret suggested. There must be regulations about eminent domain, about railroad routes. Charles nodded slowly. There are. And I know lawyers in Denver who specialize in fighting the railroads. It'll be expensive, but we'll mortgage everything if we have to, Elias said immediately. No need, Charles said. Consider it my investment in family. Over the following weeks, the pressure mounted. The bank suddenly called in a loan, claiming irregularities in paperwork. Suppliers in town became reluctant to extend credit. Several ranch hands quit after being offered better wages elsewhere, obviously Harrison's doing. But the community rallied. Other ranchers, remembering how Elias had helped them during hard times, offered their hands for temporary work. The minister's wife organized the church women to help with household tasks. Even the newspaper editor, a crusty old veteran named Josiah Mills, began writing editorials about the importance of standing against corporate tyranny. The legal battle began in Denver District Court. Margaret accompanied Charles and their lawyer, a sharp young man named Theodore Blackwood, who'd made his reputation fighting railroad overreach. The hearing was David versus Goliath, Harrison's team of lawyers against their single representative. But Blackwood had done his homework. He produced surveys showing alternative routes for the rail line, testimonies from engineers saying Harrison's proposed route was chosen for maximum profit rather than practicality, and most damaging, evidence that Harrison had bribed local officials to support his claim. Your Honor, Blackwood argued, this isn't about progress or development. It's about one man's greed destroying established communities for profit. Harrison's lawyers countered with economic arguments, promises of prosperity, thinly veiled threats about Wyoming's future without railroad cooperation. The judge, an elderly man named Corwin, listened impassively. During a recess, Harrison approached Margaret in the courthouse hallway. This doesn't have to be ugly, he said. My offer stands. Take it and walk away wealthy. Wealth isn't everything, mister. Harrison, spoken like someone who's never been truly poor. Margaret thought of her cottage in Red Fern Ridge, the gaps in the walls, the nights she'd gone hungry to save money to send to her mother. You're wrong. I've been poor in money and rich in it, but I've learned that being poor in integrity is the only poverty that matters. Pretty words won't save your ranch. Maybe not, but they'll let me sleep at night. The judge's decision came 2 weeks later. Margaret sat between Elias and Charles as Corwin read his verdict. The railroad had the right to build, but not to seize private property without proper cause and compensation. Harrison's proposed route was deemed unnecessarily destructive. The railroad would have to find another way. Harrison's face went white, then red. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping. This isn't over, he said, looking directly at Elias and Margaret. It is for now, Judge Corwin said mildly. And Mr. Harrison, any attempts at retribution will be met with federal investigation. The court will be watching. They celebrated that night in Denver, even Charles allowing himself to relax and share stories of his youth with Elizabeth, his sister. But Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that Harrison wouldn't give up so easily. She was right. They returned to find the ranch in crisis. During their absence, someone had poisoned the water supply for the eastern pasture. 50 cattle were dead, more dying. Elias rode out immediately while Margaret tested the remaining water sources, her chemistry knowledge from teaching proving useful. Arsenic, she told Elias when he returned. Industrial grade, the kind used in mining. Harrison. We can't prove it. We don't need to prove it to know it. That night, as they stood over the mass grave for the poisoned cattle, Margaret felt rage like she hadn't experienced since Holloway's attacks. These weren't just livestock. They were the ranch's future, carefully bred bloodlines that had taken years to develop. We could retaliate, Tom suggested. Harrison staying at the Grand Hotel in town. No, Elias said firmly. We're not criminals. We won because we stayed within the law. We'll keep doing that. But the attacks continued. Fences cut, horses stolen, hay barns mysteriously catching fire. Always carefully done, never with enough evidence to prosecute. The ranch began hemorrhaging money, their reserves depleting rapidly. Then Catherine lost the baby. The stress, Doc Carter said, though everyone knew it was more than that. The fear, the uncertainty, the constant vigilance required to protect their lives from Harrison's campaign of terror. Samuel was devastated, Catherine hollow-eyed with grief. "This has to stop," Margaret told Elias. "We're losing everything." "What choice do we have? Give in? Sell?" "I don't know, but we can't keep living under siege." The answer came from an unexpected source. Josiah Mills, the newspaper editor, arrived at the ranch late one evening with a portfolio of documents. "Been doing some digging," he said, spreading papers across the table. "Harrison's not as untouchable as he seems. These are records from California, Nevada, Arizona, every place he's done business. Bribery, intimidation, suspicious deaths of rivals. He's careful, but there's a pattern." "This is excellent, but how does it help us?" Elias asked. "Because I've been corresponding with journalists in those places. They're all running stories simultaneously tomorrow, and I've sent copies to the Federal Railroad Commission." Mills smiled grimly. "Harrison's about to be too busy defending himself to worry about one ranch in Wyoming." The stories broke like thunderclaps. Within days, federal investigators descended on Harrison's operations. His stock prices plummeted, investors fled, and suddenly the mighty railroad magnate was fighting for his empire's survival. Harrison left Wyoming without warning, his hired thugs disappearing overnight. The poisoning stopped, the harassment ended. The ranch began to heal, though the scars remained, in the empty pastures where cattle should have grazed, in Catherine's lingering sadness, in the wariness that had settled over them all. Winter came gently that year, as if nature itself recognized they'd had enough hardship. Margaret threw herself into teaching Thomas and Elizabeth, finding solace in their eager minds and innocent joy. Elias worked to rebuild the herds, aided by loans from Charles and neighboring ranchers who remembered their generosity. On Christmas Eve, they gathered as always, but the mood was subdued. Catherine hadn't smiled in weeks, and Samuel moved through life mechanically, all his bright ambition dimmed. It was Elizabeth who broke the spell. 6 years old and fearless, she climbed onto Samuel's lap and said, "Uncle Samuel, why don't you tell stories anymore?" "I don't have any stories, little one." "Then make one up." "About a brave knight with scars who saves a princess." Samuel looked at his niece's earnest face, then at Catherine, who was watching from across the room. "All right," he said slowly. "Once upon a time there was a knight who thought his scars made him unworthy of love." As he wove the tale, his voice growing stronger, Margaret saw Catherine lean forward, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. When Samuel finished, describing how the princess chose the scarred knight because his wounds proved his courage, Catherine crossed the room and took his hand. "We'll try again," she whispered. "When we're ready. We'll try again." Spring brought renewal in unexpected ways. The poisoned pasture, cleared and replanted, grew the richest grass anyone had seen. The ranch's reputation, enhanced by their stand against Harrison, brought premium prices for their cattle. And Catherine discovered she was pregnant again, this time carrying the baby to term, a daughter they named Hope. Charles Worthington moved permanently to Redfern Ridge, purchasing a modest house in town. "I'm too old to keep traveling," he explained, but Margaret knew the truth. He couldn't bear to be away from the family he'd found so late in life. The children thrived. Thomas showed aptitude for engineering, fascinated by the machinery increasingly used in modern ranching. Elizabeth, despite her parents' attempts at propriety, preferred riding and roping to reading and arithmetic, though she excelled at both when forced to sit still. One afternoon, as Margaret watched her daughter race across the pasture on her pony, hair flying wild and free, Elias joined her on the porch. "She's going to be trouble," he said, but with pride rather than concern. "She's going to be magnificent," Margaret corrected. "Like her father, unstoppable once she decides on something." "Like her mother, you mean? I just bull through obstacles. You find ways around them." They stood together, comfortable in shared silence, when a rider approached, a young man in army uniform. Margaret's heart clenched, recognizing the bearing of official business. "Mr. and Mrs. Boone?" I'm Lieutenant Collins from Fort Russell. I have a proposition from General Morrison." They listened as he explained. The Army needed a steady supply of beef for its expanding Western operations, but more than that, they needed someone to coordinate supplies from multiple ranches, someone with proven organizational skills and integrity. "It would mean regular trips to various forts," the lieutenant explained. "Possibly some danger, definitely a lot of responsibility, but the position would make you essentially irreplaceable to the Army's Western operations." "Why us?" Elias asked. "Because you stood up to Harrison. Because you've united the local ranchers. Because General Morrison's brother was Jake Morrison, who died defending your ranch, and he believes in honoring loyalty." Margaret and Elias exchanged glances, a whole conversation in a look. "We'll need to discuss it," Margaret said. "Of course. The general will await your answer." After the lieutenant left, they called a family meeting. The opportunity was discussed from every angle: the benefits, the risks, the changes it would require. "It would secure the ranch permanently," Samuel pointed out. "No one would dare threaten an official Army supplier." "It would mean more time away," Catherine worried. "More danger." "It would mean the children could go to college without worry," Charles added. "Security for generations." In the end, it was Thomas who settled it. "You've always taught us to serve something bigger than ourselves," he told his parents. "This is your chance." Elias accepted the position, with Margaret as his unofficial but essential partner. Their first assignment took them to Fort Laramie, where they discovered chaos. Supplies mismanaged, contracts confused, local suppliers alienated. Margaret took charge of the paperwork, while Elias handled the practical arrangements. Within a month, they'd transformed the fort's supply system, earning the gratitude of officers and enlisted men alike. "You two are quite a team," General Morrison told them. He was nothing like his brother physically. Small, neat, intellectual, but had the same directness Margaret remembered in Jake. "We've had practice," Elias replied. The work was demanding but rewarding. They traveled between forts, sometimes together, sometimes separately, always returning to the ranch that remained their anchor. The children grew, educated by Catherine at the improved school, shaped by the land and the values of their parents. One evening, returning from a particularly challenging negotiation with Apache suppliers in New Mexico, Margaret found Elias standing in what had been her old cottage near town, now used for storage. "Remembering," she asked, "thinking how far we've come. That terrified schoolteacher and the tongue-tied rancher with his contract. We weren't terrified and tongue-tied. We were. We just hit it well." Margaret laughed, moving into his arms. "Maybe a little terrified. Look what we built from that fear. Not from fear, from courage. The courage to take a chance on strangers. We're not strangers anymore." "No," Margaret agreed. "Now we're everything." As summer turned to autumn, the ranch hosted a celebration, the 10th anniversary of the railroad's arrival. The entire county attended, testament to the Boone family's position in the community. Harrison was long gone, his empire broken and scattered. Holloway was a cautionary tale told to children. But the Boones endured, stronger for every challenge. During the celebration, old Judge Morrison, now retired, pulled Margaret aside. "I want to show you something." He produced a yellowed document, the original marriage contract. "Elias asked me to keep this safe. Thought you might want it for your children someday." Margaret read the careful terms, the practical arrangements, the complete absence of emotion in the language. It seemed to belong to different people, strangers who couldn't imagine what they would become. "Keep it," she told the judge. "Let it remind them that love doesn't always start with romance. Sometimes it starts with need and grows into something neither party expected." As the party continued around her, Margaret found a quiet moment to observe her world. Elias deep in conversation with fellow ranchers about sustainable grazing practices. Samuel and Catherine dancing despite his weakened arm, their daughter Hope toddling between them. Thomas demonstrating some mechanical innovation to fascinated younger boys. Elizabeth challenging anyone who would listen to a horse race. Charles Worthington sat with Rosa and Tom, the unlikely trio having formed a deep friendship. The townspeople mingled with ranch hands, boundaries of class and origin dissolved by shared history and mutual respect. This was what they'd built from a contract born of loneliness and pragmatism. Not just a ranch or a fortune, but a community, a legacy, a life worth living. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Elias found Margaret and pulled her into an impromptu dance. Around them, others joined in, music rising from fiddles and guitars, laughter echoing across the valley. "No regrets?" Elias asked, their private ritual. "Never," Margaret replied, then added, "Actually, one." He looked concerned. "What?" "I wish I'd shot Marcus Holloway sooner." Elias laughed, the sound rich and full. "My warrior woman." "Your partner," she corrected, "in all things." The music swelled and they danced on, surrounded by family and friends, on land they'd defended with blood and tears, under stars that had witnessed their transformation from strangers to soulmates. In the house, tucked safely in Elias's desk, lay the contract that had started it all. But it was just paper now, its terms long since superseded by something unwritten and unbreakable, a love that had grown from the harsh soil of necessity into something beautiful and enduring. The party lasted until dawn, stories shared, bonds strengthened, future plans discussed. As the last guest departed and the family gathered for breakfast, exhausted but happy, Elizabeth asked, "Will we always live here?" "This is our home," Elias said simply. "But what if we want to see the world?" Thomas asked. "Then you'll go see it," Margaret answered. "But you'll always have this place to return to. That's what home means. Not a cage that keeps you in, but a foundation that lets you fly." "Like Uncle Samuel going to Chicago?" Elizabeth asked. "Exactly like that." As the morning sun climbed higher, bathing the ranch in golden light, Margaret stood with her family on the porch, looking out over the land they'd fought to keep. The challenges weren't over. They never were in this life. There would be droughts and floods, market crashes and new threats, but they would face them as they'd faced everything else, together, united by bonds stronger than blood, forged in the crucible of frontier life. The contract marriage had become a true partnership. The lonely teacher and the giant cowboy had become parents and pillars of their community, and the empty land had become filled with life and purpose. This was their story, written not in legal terms but in lived experience, signed not with ink but with courage, witnessed not by a judge but by the mountains themselves. And it was far from over.